That night, Kevin's dreams were so vivid that when he woke up, he thought, well, I'm drunk. I'm hallucinating already. His head rattled so much that he had no strength to get out of bed. The man rolled over onto his side with difficulty and slowly got up. There were pills somewhere. He pulled out the nightstand drawer, began fumbling around inside with his hand to dissolve the pill in a glass of water. Kevin drank and lay down again. He dreamt about his father that night, his father. He was angry with his son, swearing and pointing out mistakes. But what he had done to his mother. You're selfish and a scoundrel, the father was saying. And Kevin stood in front of him as he had so many years ago as a child and never looked up. Mother gave her whole life to your upbringing, denied herself even the smallest things. And you. The dream was so clear that Kevin could almost physically feel the slap his father gave him. At that moment, his mom had to stand up for her son. She had always protected him from everyone, calmed his father when he got hot, defended him to the teachers at school, rebuked the neighborhood kids when they took his bike away from him. Where's the mother? His father was getting more and more demanding, and he was about to punish Kevin. But Mom wasn't in the dream. She never came to help her son. And that realization made him feel cold inside. Fear gripped his whole body, and a drop of sweat stood on his forehead. Kevin woke up like that, covered in cold sweat. The man hadn't seen his mother in 5 years. Maybe she's dead, he thought, and the thought made his head crack even harder. Kevin slowly looked around the room. Slowly, he began to remember everything that had happened the day before. Yesterday, bailiffs had shown up at his office with a notice that Kevin no longer owned the firm. His accounts were seized, and he had to leave the apartment within 10 days. Are you out of your mind? Kevin exploded. Get out of here, or I'll call security. The man reached for his phone to dial the number of the head of security, but the uniformed man held out a ruling to him. What's this? What are you pulling on me? Your papers, go away with them. Reading what was printed on the white sheet, Kevin was confused. The document stated that Moore Alex was the new owner of the firm. Wait, the man said in a more peaceful tone. How about I call this Moore Alex that's mentioned in the document? I'll try to find out. I know her. Please. Indifferently said the man in uniform. Just hurry. We can't stay here long. Kevin frantically dialed Alex's number, not understanding what had happened or why she was the owner of his firm. This is some kind of misunderstanding, he thought. For a moment, the man thought he had just been the victim of a joke, like a popular TV program. Now the door is going to open, the camera crew will come in and everyone will announce, this is a prank. But all I heard in the phone was a polite voice. The caller is temporarily unavailable. Shit, Kevin cursed. You can only take personal items. Everything else has to stay in the office. Seeing that the attempt to reach Alex was going nowhere, the bailiff pointed Kevin toward the door. Please step outside. Still not understanding anything, the man headed for the door. On his way out, he mumbled, I'll call the lawyers, I'll find out. This is definitely some kind of misunderstanding. That's your right, the uniformed man replied calmly, locking the door behind Kevin. Have a good day. Walking out of the office, Kevin dialed Ben's number. Ben had been his friend since childhood. Ben, need to meet, the man said, as soon as a familiar voice was heard in the receiver. I'm in trouble. No problem, Brother Ben replied. Where and when? Let's do it at our waterfront bar. Get there as soon as you can. Deal. I will. When Jorah entered the bar, Kevin had almost finished the bottle of whiskey. Drink, he asked his friend, and without waiting for an answer, poured the rest of the drink into a glass, then waved his hand to the waiter. Chef, bring another bottle and an appetizer. Something tasty. What a day you're having, Brother Ben examined his friend critically. What's the matter, party or something? You're not going to believe this. I got kicked out of my own office today. They also said my accounts were blocked, and I had to move out of my apartment within 10 days. You see, I've been kicked out of my own firm, and I'm not allowed in my apartment anymore, Kevin was saying. I don't understand, Ben replied calmly, sipping from his glass and taking a bite of lemon slices. You've been doing fine, no problem. "I don't get it either," Kevin said with despair in his voice. "But most importantly, friend, you don't know the most important thing. They showed me a piece of paper that says I'm no longer the owner, but the new owner of the firm." "Who do you think that is?" Ben looked at his friend with interest, waiting to watch Kevin pour whiskey from a new bottle. "The new owner of the firm is more, Alex," Kevin said ominously and slowly, looking directly at Ben. "You're Alex?" Ben squeezed out of his mouth in surprise. "How so? Did you sign the firm over to her? Wasn't it enough for you that she's already sitting on her neck with boutiques and spas?" "Wouldn't have occurred to me. It's incomprehensible how she now owns both the firm and the money in my apartment." Kevin was furious. "I don't know," yelled Kevin, slamming his fist on the table so hard that their gazes were caught by the bar patrons, and the security guard tensed, preparing to intervene. "Let's ask her," Kevin suggested, and pulled out his smartphone to dial Alex's number again. "The caller is still unavailable," he said doomily as the familiar message lit up on the screen again. "Maybe she's at the spa? That's where the girls usually turn their phones off," Ben suggested thoughtfully. "Let the hell help her." Kevin poured into glasses and continued drinking. In the morning, he barely remembered what had happened afterward. Only bits and pieces of the night flashed through his mind, as the guard politely but insistently invited them out. Kevin tried to resist, but Ben and the security guard pushed him outside. Ben shoved his friend into a cab and sat next to him himself to drive him home. Kevin woke up in his bed with an understandable weight in his head and a terrifying lightness in his soul. Everything that had surrounded him just yesterday now seemed distant and alien. He got up, jogging barefoot across the cool floor, and headed for the kitchen. "Geez, Ben, you could have taken care of that," he thought sadly, when there was nothing in the fridge to help with waking up after a drunken binge. After a shower, which provided a faint glimmer of freshness, Kevin's thoughts began to slowly cohere into something coherent. His car. The car could be the key to solving at least some of the problems, because there was no mention of it in the paperwork. "I'm going to Alex. Alex will explain everything," he decided, already in jeans and a t-shirt, systematically brewing coffee. Perhaps he was still under the influence of shock, but he strongly wanted to believe that what had happened was a misunderstanding that could be resolved. As luck would have it, the car was at the office, which meant it would be a cab ride to get there. On the way to the Jeep, Kevin had contacted Susan's secretary, not having clarified the situation, but having done at least one good deed, sending the girl home early. Now he was driving, making his way through the pulsing avenue, and mental rehearsals of a possible conversation with Alex were bouncing around in his head. She'd say it was a joke, everything would fall into place, and his life would get back on track. But it wasn't optimistic confidence that chased him away. It was the duty of seeking the truth. Kevin had to find out. He couldn't just lose everything he had. After all, he had plans, dreams. Every day he set goals for himself. There was a meeting ahead, full of hopes and fears, but he was ready. Ready for anything. Well, life throws challenges sometimes, and it's up to you to accept them. Sinking down on the couch, Kevin crossed his arms over his chest, feeling all the exhausted lightness give way to a heavy daze. Despite his spinning head and sense of loss, he demanded answers. "I want to hear an explanation. Now," he said with a note of desperation and demandingness in his voice, like a judge ready to pass judgment. And he continued in the same vein, "You, Alex, how could you do this? How could you steal from me? And you, Ben, how could you do this to me?" To your friend, the questions poured in layer after layer, but the distinct demand in them was the truth. Alex, confused half a minute ago, now looked determined. Despite the heaviness of the air lightened by betrayal, she gave the impression of someone who wasn't used to backing down. "Look, Kevin, your business was going under, and if it wasn't for me, you'd still be losing the firm and the apartment." She began, rising to her feet and walking past him as if barely tolerating her touching the air. "You didn't want to see things go to financial disaster yourself. I just took from you what would have slipped through your fingers as it was." Ben, who had already taken a seat at the bar, remained strangely calm, playfully turning his glass with a look that spoke of his involvement in this conspiracy. "Give it a rest, Kevin." It was all just a matter of time. He tossed back phlegmatically, wrinkling his nose at a sip of wine, as if he had already calmed down with the thought of the upcoming conversation. "Then you're the one who set it all up. You and Alex. Kevin's words came out of him like gunshots, each word charged with pain and bewilderment. Ben nodded slowly. Alex's gaze met Kevin's firmly, and in the silence that suddenly poisoned the space, it was clear that Kevin's excitement was no more than the noise before the storm. The truth, painful and incomprehensible, but a truth that was causing him as much distress as it was liberating, spread out before him. "We'll explain everything," Alex added lastly, giving a voice of confidence. But it was confidence not in getting everything back to normal, but in a new chapter in which Kevin would be entirely at the mercy of his former friend and betrayed lover. Ben stood before Kevin, shoulders squared, as if his words were the final nail in the lid of this grim sarcophagus of bad luck and betrayal. Kevin, on the other hand, felt like he was in a black abyss, where Ben's every word echoed precisely, shattering the remnants of his world to pieces. "Since childhood friends? You mean when I was your understudy, that shadow that was always forgotten?" Ben continued with a nasty sneer in his voice, his words like a blade, each one casting a shadow of humiliation and spite on the buddyhood that had been between them. Alex, who had already become just a figurehead in this game of two men, stood silently aside, like a statue, whose role was reduced only to the reason for the whole sinister drama. Kevin felt Ben's every word piercing him. The ringing of his own naivety and gullibility, which he had ignored for so long, was now turning into a deafening pain in his heart. He realized that his world, which he had so trusted and treated with such carelessness, had been shattered not only by the hands of others, but also by his own blunders. And yet why, Ben? Why so cruel? Kevin's question rang with confusion and genuine sadness, his gaze now filled with belated understanding. How could you go through all this while melting so much poison in your soul? But the echo of his question was lost in the emptiness of the room, where the old bonds of friendship no longer had any place in anyone's mind. Vitalik realized that in the game of power and a series of life lessons, he was left alone with the wreckage of the past, and he was faced with the task of putting himself back together again, learning not only to survive, but also to recognize those who could truly be trusted in the future. Kevin left the searing tangle of words and humiliation behind him as the apartment door slammed behind him. With each step toward the elevator, he sank deeper into his thoughts, as if they were his only companion in this moment. He didn't need their paltry money. His pride and will for justice demanded a larger solution. Armed with a suitcase with a modest supply of cash from his safe, Kevin could at least secure himself from the inevitable for the time being. Stunned by the heavy thoughts and bitter reality, he involuntarily moved in the direction where his mother's village was to be his only point of support and refuge. Having not seen his mother for 5 years, he swallowed the bitterness of his act of leaving her there while he himself drowned in the bustle and pleasures of the city. It was time to make amends, appealing for the forgiveness that only a parent's heart can bestow unconditionally and generously. It was getting dark. The long, slanting shadows of the trees at the edge of the road cut across the path, which was bathed in the fading light of sunset. Kevin was tired of being atomized by the dozens of small problems that had happened earlier. Now he needed solitude to gather his thoughts, for he had a difficult meeting ahead of him, and he would have to gather his strength. Nature promised to be his companion in this journey of memories and experiences. As he left the city behind, his thoughts were like a caged animal, searching for a way out of the maze of feelings and frustrations. Kevin realized it was time for change and self-discovery. His mother, Sharon, and that petition for forgiveness he inevitably sought seemed like a beacon in his turbulent sea of problems. Every kilometer away from the life to which he had grown accustomed brought him closer to true values, and to that simple existence from which he had fled for so long, but to which he now sought a way back. In war and in love, as in the game of pardoning fate, all means are good, and Kevin was ready to go all the way, only to find again the world he had unwittingly destroyed. Sharon, despite the conventions and drudgery of village life, possessed an undeniable inner light and tenacity that was a recipe for a worthy future. Determined to link her destiny with the capital, she bravely left home and her parents in the hope of a better life and the opportunity to support them from the outside. Strongly attached to her parents and understanding the severity of leaving, Sharon always kept in her heart the image of her native home, cozy evenings with her mother and hunting mornings with her father. Entering technical school, and then finding employment in the capital city, allowed her to become the support her parents were looking for as they aged. Life in the capital opened up a new world full of prospects and opportunities for Sharon, but she had to sacrifice her connection to her homeland and the warmth of her family home. The factory, where she got a position in the personnel department, became a second home for her. And the man, the shop foreman, who took care of her, eventually turned out to be the man who became her husband, friend, and colleague. The passing years have taken Sharon far away from her parents' home and habits, but her soul has never lost the connection that was established in her early childhood love and devotion to family. And now, as Kevin, her son, drove to visit her in the wilderness, where she had gone 5 years ago to live out her final years away from the hustle and bustle of the city, he carried in his heart the hope of reunion and forgiveness, realizing that no matter the distance or the time spent, the warmth of family always remains in the heart. The weight of grief enveloped Sharon like the fog surrounding the morning fields as she returned to her own doorsteps, now motherless. The lives that had once boiled on either side of the hedge had faded, and the village, like an old man, had succumbed to the languor of aging and resigned itself to time. Longing and guilt, mingled with the warm fondness of memory, burdened Sharon's soul as she gazed upon the peaceful face of her mother in her coffin. How alive it had once been here, and how lonely it looked now, lost in desolation and oblivion. Their conversation at the table that evening did not wade evasively through the thorns of mundane trivialities, but poured forth in a direct tone of pain and consolation. His father was sympathetic to Sharon's words, the storm of emotion and simple human regret that neither he nor his mother had ever seen their grandchildren had cut the threads of their expectations and dreams. Fred, though he cast a reproachful glance, still, deep down, shared that same feeling, that both he and Sharon were victims of the unforeseen circumstance of their life together. But even in that sadness, there was a gentle understanding that the path of the heart is unpredictable, and sometimes all that remains is to accept its twists and turns with wisdom and care. Sharon felt like a little girl trying hard to fetch water from the well, stack firewood, and plow the vegetable garden. Only this time she needed to bring the sincerest comforting caress to the hearts that loved her and had remained waiting by her side despite all the vicissitudes and obstacles. The impending sadness could only strengthen their mutual understanding and wait together for the unanticipated joy to once again knock at their humble cottage. Sharon and Fred's fate was intertwined with the beliefs and wisdom of past generations, with the belief in predestination and eternal traditions that live in the hearts of the people of their village. Sometimes ancient customs and healing rituals could bring peace and even new hope to those who believed in them. The dipping practice the father shared with his daughter and son-in-law was more than just immersion in ice water. It was an ancient way of healing and cleansing, often going back much further than centuries. The mysterious ways of Providence came together when, after a ritual in the woods at the waterfall and her father's words about the possible gift of life after death in the family, which was a reflection of a belief in balance and replenishment, Sharon learned she was expecting a child. A long-awaited miracle that was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Though joy was mixed with the bitterness of loss, with Kevin's arrival into Sharon and Fred's lives, the gray everyday skies of their existence lit up with new colors. And finding that unspeakable joy in the eyes of their newborn son, the couple opened a new page of their family book, where letters were born from the looks and smiles of their baby. Each new day of Kevin's life was a living reminder of the boundless love that parents can give their child, even in the shadow of past trials and losses. Although life is often full of challenges and does not always obey our wishes or plans, there is room for wonder and rebirth when the old is gone, giving way to the new. The wisdom of their ancestors helped Sharon and Fred find their way to this new beginning. The story of Sharon and Fred's family emerges in the clear lines of a simple and traditional household, where each seeks his or her own path to happiness, and each has his or her own methods in molding a future for their child. A 2-bedroom apartment in a new building was their dream and the achievement of their long years of thrift and work. For little Kevin, who was all their pride and happiness, they chose the best they had to offer, although their views on parenting diverged. Fred, in giving his son attention and guidance, wished only to instill in him the example of courage and fortitude that he considered necessary in the life of a sturdy man. Sharon, for her part, surrounded her son with tenderness and endless attention, often giving in to his little desires, which created a certain disagreement in the approach between the spouses. Kevin, a cheerful and resourceful boy, grows up in love and prosperity, but childish pranks, sometimes growing into major mischief, make you think about the boundaries of permissible and how to reconcile strictness and mercy in the process of upbringing. Broken window and complaints from the school became the catalyst that forced Sharon to share with her husband the full picture of what was happening. It became a serious discussion about how children should be raised and what values they should be taught so that they remain both kind and strong individuals. Ultimately, the episode may have been a boost to Kevin's internal discipline and a point of convergence in Sharon and Fred's parenting beliefs. Challenging trials over time may have strengthened the bond of each member of this family and helped them build a bright and strong future together. The love invested in the younger generation certainly multiplies and returns, but also requires wise direction to avoid mistakes and move through life's journey with firmness and integrity. The paths of fathers and children often diverge, as the plans of the younger generation and their vision of the future are often radically different from the attitudes and experiences of their parents. Kevin, full of ambition and thirst for self-realization, decided to reject his father's offer to follow the beaten path and took the course to create his own business, which is a bold step towards independence. It's worth noting that while the emotions and stress accompanying this decision may spice up the family situation, Kevin has the opportunity to use the skills and knowledge he gained at the Institute and the experience he gained at his previous workplace to realize his dream. Notably, Kevin's request for financial support risks causing a dilemma for Sharon. On the one hand, she loves her son immensely and wants to support him in all his endeavors, and on the other hand, she understands the potential risks and uncertainties of entrepreneurship that go against her late husband's beliefs. The challenge for Sharon, as a parent who has been left without the support of her spouse, is to find a balance between wanting to help her child in his endeavors and managing the family's savings wisely. With the example of a husband who has always worked hard for the family, wisdom will be required in deciding whether to support her son's ambitions and give him a chance at independence, or to leave savings as a guarantee of emotional and financial stability in the future. Kevin, now perhaps realizing the weight of responsibility and stepping into the role of head of the family, faces his own challenges in building the future he seeks, but it's never too late to learn new things, including how to run a business wisely in the spirit of the times, with an eye for risks, but also for promising opportunities. Sharon saw her son growing up, stepping confidently into life, building a career, and even founding his own business. She had no regrets about supporting his endeavors, for what mattered most to her was to see Kevin happy and successful. A special hope was kindled in Sharon's heart when her son announced a visit from a girl. Perhaps this was the kind of change in their family that could bring new joys and perhaps the promise of a continuing lineage. These thoughts were certainly sunshine in the daily routine of a woman who had dedicated her life to her family and son. Kevin and Alex's meeting, full of mutual sympathy and obvious attraction, with signs of attention and flirting, could be the beginning of something bigger and more serious. Vitalik, seizing the moment and taking the initiative in his own hands, as if speaking about readiness for new steps in his personal life. It seems that new developments are just around the corner, and perhaps soon Sharon, proud and hopeful, will be babysitting grandchildren, seeing her family grow and continuing the family traditions that she and her late husband cherished so dearly. All that remains now is to wish that fate will spare them any unexpected twists and turns and offer a smooth path to shared happiness and well-being. The evening at the club continued into an unexpected morning in a new location, and Kevin had to awaken in a foreign environment, making attempts to contact his friend for help. The headache and heaviness of the morning after a stormy night had him seeking some sort of relief, albeit with a cheerful hint. "Careful," she warned. "I might tease." "Oh, really? Such a cutie and hurt a poor, lonely guy? I wouldn't believe it in a million years," Kevin tried to make a joke. "Here's to introductions." He took a drink, set the glass aside, and turned to the bartender. "Buddy, another one." Alex drank the cocktail slowly, gazing up at the man. "Are you alone?" the girl asked. "Not really. My friend and I agreed to get together and hang out for a while. We've been working," Kevin replied and took a sip of whiskey. "Cool stuff," cranky Alex grimaced. "And where does this poor Kevin work that he gets so tired?" "Poor Kevin is the director of his own firm." "Wait a minute, what's poor?" "Poor Kevin isn't poor at all." The man laughed. "There's my friend, Ben." Ben walked up to the counter. Kevin introduced his new acquaintance to his friends, and the company moved to a table in the main hall. Kevin realized that he liked Alex more and more, and this interest only grew stronger with each cocktail they drank. The club was already closing when they went outside. Alex wrapped her arms around Kevin's neck and whispered, "Do you want to continue the evening?" "I really do," Kevin murmured. "Then let's go to my place." "Do you have anything strong?" he asked, cradling Alex by her slim waist. "It'll turn up." Kevin spent the night at Alex's house, and in the morning, barely able to get his head off the pillow, he decided to call Ben. I had to get home somehow. Only long beeps were heard. "Are you up already, honey? Good morning," sounded from Alex, who was lounging in bed. She reached over to the nightstand where the started bottle of champagne stood and poured into a glass. After taking a sip, she held it out to Kevin. "Want some? It'll stop the headache." "No stronger?" the man asked. She moved her head and her hair spread across the pillow. "Come on." "There's no one to ride home with anyway," agreed Kevin. "How about a cab?" Alex pointed to Kevin's cell phone. "Or do you just not want to go?" she reminded. Kevin lowered himself into the girl's arms. Panting, they lay in silence, breathing heavily. "Something's making me hungry. Why don't you cook something?" Kevin suggested. No cooking, and I don't like to cook," Alex flatly refused. "Why don't we go out? Like for lunch?" "Where?" "A restaurant, for example." "Let's do that." Kevin decided that this wonderful night should end just as beautifully. "Only I'll make one phone call." "Okay." "I'm going to take a shower." Alex wrapped herself in a sheet and headed down the hall. Sharon was in a hurry from work and had to stop at the store for groceries. "My son is bringing his son to meet his girlfriend today." She was overwhelmed with joy. No doubt she's from Kevin's work, smart, kind, and very pretty. No other way. Arriving home, Sharon set about dinner. After popping the chicken, carefully marinated from the morning, into the oven, she started on the appetizers. In the living room, she laid out a beautiful tablecloth, dishes and utensils on the table. When everything was ready, the doorbell rang. "Mom, we're here," Kevin exclaimed cheerfully, kissing Sharon on the cheek. "Here to meet you. This is Alex." "Nice to meet you," the woman replied with a smile, sizing the girl up. Alex was different from the one Sharon had painted in her imagination. "And I'm Sharon." The girl smiled back and looked around the hallway. "Well, what are we standing around for?" "Come on into the hall," Sharon invited. She staggered into the kitchen, while Alex continued to survey her surroundings. "Nice apartment you have here. Do you two live here together?" Alex asked. "Yeah, my dad passed away, and it's just me and my mom," Kevin replied, uncorking a bottle of champagne. "Why aren't you getting married?" the girl inquired. "Somehow it never occurred to me. Maybe I haven't met the one I'd like to spend my life with yet," the man replied. "Are you sure? Or maybe your mom just doesn't let you," Alex laughed. Kevin looked at her, not knowing if she was joking or if she seriously thought he was a mama's boy. "Come on, I have a great mom," he said. "I don't even doubt it." "Don't worry," the girl put her arms around Kevin's neck and kissed him. Sharon walked into the room and was slightly confused when she saw the young ones. "Well, everything is ready. We can sit down at the table," she said, holding up a platter of fried chicken. "It smells so good, Mommy." Kevin turned up his nose. "I love it when you roast chicken with your signature recipe." "Thanks, son," Sharon replied. Wanting to lighten the mood at the table, she turned to Alex. "What do you, Alex, like to cook? Share a recipe." Alex looked perplexed at the woman, then at Kevin. "I don't like to cook anything," she replied. "I prefer to eat at restaurants, or at the very least order takeout." Sharon was surprised. "Well, how can that be? How are you going to feed your husband and children? After all, everyone knows that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. That wisdom works, believe me." "So you married Kevin's dad because of your chicken frying skills?" Alex asked, not the least bit embarrassed, reaching out for the salad. Sharon froze for a moment, stopping chewing. This question seemed to her open rudeness and tactlessness. The smile slowly slid off the woman's face. She looked at Alex, who continued to put on the salad, unsuspecting. Feeling awkward, Kevin tried to defuse the situation. Mommy, Alex wanted to tell you that you are a very good cook, and Daddy just couldn't help but fall in love with such a good hostess. He looked at Alex. She nodded, having realized it. Yeah, that's what I meant to say, she added, not stopping chewing. The dinner conversation never really got going. After tea and cake, Kevin and Alex began to pack up. I'll walk Alex out and come back, Kevin said goodbye and kissed his mother on the cheek. Sharon continued to clear the table. She still didn't want to say goodbye to her guest, showing her displeasure with her son's choice. When Kevin returned, Sharon was just about to go to bed after taking a sedative. Mom, are you still awake? Kevin asked, peeking into the bedroom. It's not like that, she sighed. Your friend of yours gave me a blood pressure spike. I had to take medicine. Mom, why are you making this so complicated? The man resented her. Alex is a normal, modern girl. She doesn't want to stand at the stove, she won't. Nowadays you can order food, laundry can be taken to a laundromat. Professionals can clean the house too. It's normal. A woman wants to be beautiful and well-groomed, not to get tired of cooking and cleaning. Do you think I'm tortured? Sharon objected. I always took care of Daddy. He had clean shirts, he was fed, and we used to mold dumplings together. Do you remember that? And your girlfriend doesn't know how dumplings are made or where to get clean underwear. Mom, this is my choice, my life, Kevin tried to argue. All she wants from you is money. Look at her. Sharon was outraged. She's dressed like, God forbid, what would Dad say if he saw a girl like that? Mom, that's it. That's enough. Kevin rolled his eyes. I'm off to bed. I have to get up early tomorrow, Kevin said, and walked out of his mother's bedroom, carefully closing the door behind him. Sharon was left sitting at the dressing table, looking in the mirror at her face, noting the signs of fatigue and signs of aging that had been especially evident since her husband's death. Maybe retire, she thought. It wasn't a new thought. Often she had reasoned about ending her working life, especially as her eyesight and health were beginning to fail and new technology was causing difficulties. It's decided. I'll talk to the boss tomorrow, she finally decided. If there was someone willing to take her place, she wouldn't interfere and would retire, making way for the young. Kevin was in a great mood. His trading company would be a year old. The results were excellent and profits were growing. Partners were increasing. Accounts were being replenished. He decided to thank the team for their contribution and throw a party. When the anniversary celebration was held in a room that had been cleared out for the occasion, decorated and stocked with hors d'oeuvres from the catering company, Kevin gave a thank you speech followed by thunderous applause. I had no idea your staff loved and respected you so much, Alex said as she hugged Kevin. She skillfully showed everyone her special position next to the principal, emphasizing that she was more than just a friend to him. Her plans for Kevin were serious. There was only one problem left: his mother. The other day, Kevin gave Alex a luxurious fur coat. However, the gift was not bought at his own request. It so happened that during a trip around the city, Alex noticed the showcase of a fur salon and expressed her desire to go in. She convincingly stated that she adored fur coats and mantos, and Kevin could not object to her, as he was crazy about her, and he could not deny himself the pleasure to continue romantic relations with the girl. Kevin watched as Alex tried on one item after another. Eventually, she chose a blue mink coat that accentuated her figure perfectly and walked over to Kevin, who was relaxing with it while drinking coffee. Honey, look how it suits me. Don't those lips deserve such a gift? These words spoken by Alex with lipstick on her lips put Kevin in a quandary. Why don't you look at something else, dear? And preferably a smaller number on the price tag, he suggested. No, I want that one. It fits me perfectly, Alex insisted. Don't you think the price is too high? These things are cheaper in Europe, Kevin tried to convince her. However, Alex remained adamant. Finally, Kevin gave up. Wrap it up, please. His mood dropped a little because he couldn't share her joy at the purchase as much as she would have. But soon Alex managed to cheer him up again, and they went to his house. Kevin arrived home after midnight. In the morning, after an invigorating coffee from Sharon, Kevin walked over to the table where his mother had already prepared breakfast for him. You got home late last night. Did you stay late at work? She asked. No, Kevin replied briefly. Then where were you? Sharon insisted. Kevin was silent for a moment, then replied irritably. Mom, what am I, 5 years old? Are you going to control me my whole life? I go where I want to go and come back when I want to come back. Why do you care? Calm down, I was just asking, Sharon replied, a little startled. Are we that bad, or what? Kevin asked. At this time, Alex reached over to the nightstand for a pack of cigarettes. I knew it, she said resentfully. I knew it. You're just like all men. Coming on to me and then marrying some gray mouse. What makes you say that? The man asked, opening the window to light a cigarette. If you wanted to marry me, you'd have proposed already. What am I, a girl for an hour or something? Don't be silly, muttered Vitalik, waving it away. Don't I give you money? Don't buy you presents, don't fulfill your desires. All that's true, but a woman is something else entirely. By marrying, a man proves his love. You love me, don't you? I do, he admitted. Well, all right. If that's the way you want it, we'll get married, he said, putting out his cigarette. Then come to me, my kitty, Alex invited. Kevin couldn't refuse her. A few days later, Kevin picked up Alex after work, and they went to his house to inform Sharon of their intention to get married. Alex wore the new fur coat that Kevin had bought her. She wanted his mother to see that he wasn't denying her anything. When they walked in, Sharon was resting on the couch with high blood pressure. Mom, you're home. We're here, Kevin yelled as he entered the house. Realizing her son wasn't alone, Sharon got up and met them in the hall. Hi, were you resting? The son asked. Yeah, I felt a little under the weather, replied the mother. Hello, Sharon, said Alex, hello, trying to be polite, but her presence caused Sharon to feel negative emotions. Hello, Alex. Come in, I'll put the kettle on now, said Sharon, heading for the kitchen, but Alex beat her to it. Don't worry, sit back and relax. I'll do it myself, Alex suggested. Yes, Kevin, come help me, she added, receiving a supportive slap on the back from him. Sharon noticed the gesture and wrinkled her nose, feeling a dislike for Alex. As everyone sat down at the table, Alex nudged Kevin in the side, letting him know it was time to share the news. Mom, Alex and I have something we wanted to tell you, Kevin started, but Alex intercepted his words, not letting him finish. Sharon, Kevin and I are getting married, Alex said loud and clear. Sharon just sighed, focusing her gaze on her teacup. Yes, we'll apply at the registry office tomorrow. We have people we know. We won't have to wait long. We'll be married in a month, Kevin added. What's the rush? Is she pregnant? Her mother asked, nodding towards Alex. Are you crazy? Am I pregnant? That's certainly not about me, the girl resented. Sharon explained her point of view. It's just that usually those who are expecting a baby are in such a hurry, while normal people prepare for the wedding, thinking everything through. Kevin, have you heard? According to your mom, we're not normal, Alex exclaimed. Mom, that's what we've decided, and it's off the table, Kevin said calmly, trying to end the argument. Sharon accepted the news. I'm glad when you feel good. That's all I can say. But since you're with your news, there's something I want to tell you too. The couple stared at Sharon in surprise. The woman still as calmly continued to drink her tea, taking a bite of her chocolate candy. I'm retiring as of Monday, she announced abruptly. I've decided it's time for a vacation. Congratulations, Mom. It's about time, Kevin said. Wait, listen to me all the way through. Sharon stopped him, looking him straight in the eye. I want to spend this vacation in a healthy way. For that reason, I plan to go to Montana and take advantage of the mineral springs. It's good for my arthritis and hypertension. That's great. I'm happy for you, Kevin echoed. While I'm there, we'll need to make some repairs to the apartment, continued Sharon. I want to hire a finishing crew to do a quality renovation. Kevin listened intently to his mother, realizing that the repairs were long overdue. And yes, Kevin, Sharon added, I'm going to need that money I loaned you for the business. Kevin was clearly stunned, as was Alex, who looked at her lover in amazement. For Kevin, the question of repayment was a surprise. He seemed oblivious to his mother's contribution to his successful business startup. I hope you can get it back next week. I need to pay for the trip, and give a deposit to the builders. Sharon finished, pretending not to notice her embarrassed son. Alex was confused. The only thing she realized was that their wedding plans were suddenly in jeopardy. "You know what, Alex?" Sharon replied with dignity. "I'm not going to argue with you about my vacation or how I should handle my money. I've made my decision, and I expect Kevin, as a man of honor, to keep his promise." Alex suddenly rebelled. "You're old, you don't need much," she blurted out, "but I can't forget that Kevin is my fiancé and we're going to start a family." Kevin tried to interject, but Alex interrupted him. "I'm your wife without 5 minutes, and I have a lot to say about how we're going to spend your money. If I want a wedding, there will be one." Irritation and misunderstanding filled the room, whereupon Alex abruptly left the apartment, leaving Kevin and his mother at a loss. Sharon turned to her son, demanding attention to her own words. "Sit down, I'm not done yet." "But Mom, that money." "They're on the business," Kevin tried to object, mindful of his company's current obligations. "When you needed it, I didn't procrastinate," Sharon reminded him, "and now I'm counting on your integrity. My plans come first now." "And my plans, my wedding?" Kevin asked, confused. "It's your life, your decisions," Sharon coined, "but you have to respect mine as well. Don't forget the decency and mutual family support that you and I have always valued." "What does that have to do with me? What does that have to do with you? You should at the very least be pleased, and at the very most, you should help me." "No, my dear. Everything I had to do, I did for you. You're an adult. You're in your 4th decade, so the word should doesn't apply to me anymore. You're the one who has to take care of, protect and support your mother in her old age. Or do you have a different opinion?" "You're being unfair, inhuman, depriving me of the opportunity to marry," Kevin said sadly. "I'm not stopping you. Marry whoever you want to marry. Just give me the money. And let's finish this pointless conversation." Sharon left the kitchen and went to her bedroom. Kevin sat there thinking. He was figuring out in his mind how to get out of this situation without getting in a fight with his mother and Alex, and without losing profits at the firm. He really had to pay for the next delivery of goods, and it was quite a large sum. He dialed Alex's phone number, deciding to go to her, to discuss everything, and at the same time to stay at her place for the night. But she didn't answer the phone. "She's offended," Kevin thought. He turned off the kitchen light and left the apartment. Getting into his car, the man headed for his mistress's house. The light in her window was on. Kevin noticed that while still driving up to Alex's house. But when he rang the doorbell, no one opened the door. The man started pounding on the door with his fist. "Alex, open up. We need to talk." Footsteps were heard outside the door. Kevin exhaled with relief. "What do you want?" Alex asked through the door. "To talk. We already talked. I thought you were a man, and it turns out you can't decide anything without your mommy." "Yes, I can, honey. Open up," Kevin asked. The door opened quietly. The man stepped into the hallway. Alex stood with her back against the wall, pouting her lips and looking at the floor. Her whole look showed how much she resented Kevin and his mother. "Well, aren't you sorry, sweetheart?" The man tried to hug her, but Alex pushed him away. "Tell me, who do you want to live with mommy or with me?" she asked. "Of course with you, my love," Kevin answered. "Then why don't you consider me at all? Do I have to get married in a robe? And my guests will eat Olivier and potatoes with cutlets in the dining room." "Don't worry, it won't happen. You just have to wait a little longer," Kevin urged her. "I don't want to wait," Alex objected. "Can't your mom wait with her stupid historical parishes?" "I don't know, honey, but we'll figure something out together." So he pulled the girl against him and quietly pushed her towards the bedroom. Alex gave in. She knew all the strings that Kevin pulled, for which it was possible to control him skillfully. Then, lying in bed, they thought up a plan of further actions. "Maybe we should send your mother to one of the relatives," Alex asked. "Why?" Kevin didn't understand. "To keep her out of the way, don't you understand? Let her stay here, and we'll have a wedding in the meantime. And when she arrives, will you give her the money? Or part of it?" She doesn't even have any relatives, Kevin puffed on his cigarette. She had relatives. Her father and mother lived in a remote village, but they died a long time ago. I was just a kid. Where was that village? The mistress asked. Somewhere in Arkansas. And I didn't seem to go into much detail. Didn't her parents leave her daughter anything when she died? If there's no one else, she must have gotten some kind of inheritance. Oh, please, don't be ridiculous. What kind of inheritance is there in a remote village? It's a small house, but it's probably rotten by now. My mother once went to my parents' grave and told me that almost all the houses in the village were abandoned. Everything was dead. Alex raised herself up on her elbows and looked carefully into Kevin's eyes. There was triumph in her gaze. "This is the way out, my dear," she said, smiling. Kevin arrived home on time on the appointed day. Sharon noted that he was strange, always trying to serve something, and then he asked her to have tea with him and talk. After the fight the other day, they hardly spoke at all. But apparently the son had come to his senses and realized his mother was right. Kevin poured aromatic tea into cups and moved the sugar from his mother. "How are things at the firm, son?" the woman asked. "All good as usual. We are working, moving forward." "You know, not a step backward," Kevin said, smiling. The mother thought his smile was strained, unnatural. "What do you do? Did you go to a travel agency?" Sharon began to tell her story. But her son interrupted her and asked her to bring a clean hand towel. The woman went to her room, and he quickly took a vial out of his pocket and dribbled it into his mother's cup. It was a sleeping pill that had been administered for hours the day before by Alex's mistress. "Here, I brought this, here you go." His mother handed Kevin a towel. "Thank you, Mom," he said. "Now we can have tea in peace. You drink too." The woman drank the whole cup and suddenly felt faint. She leaned against the wall. "I don't feel well, Kevin," she said. But the man had already taken her in his arms and carried her into the room. He put her on the couch and hurried into the hallway to open the front door. "Are you asleep? Did everything work out?" Alex asked as she entered the apartment. "Yeah, I think she's asleep. We hurried. We have to get there before she wakes up." Kevin took his mother in his arms and Alex grabbed a blanket and a pillow from the couch. They walked out of the apartment and down to the backyard. The man put his mother in the back seat, placing a pillow under her head and covering her with the blanket. Opening the trunk, he threw in Sharon's warm clothes Alex had gathered. Several bags of groceries stood nearby. Slamming the doors, Kevin and Alex hit the road. As they pulled onto the country highway, Kevin increased his speed. He drove as fast as he could, afraid that his mother would wake up and his and Alex's plan would fail. In 5 hours, they reached the remote village where Sharon had been born and raised. They found her parents' house. There was almost no snow in the city, but here it was still knee-deep. Sneaking to the gate, Kevin struggled to open it and then the door to the house. Then he went back to the car, carried his mother into the hut, and put her on the bed. "Where should I put the groceries?" Alex asked, standing in the doorway with the bags. On the table, Kevin pointed. He covered the mother with a blanket and put a coat on top, so that the woman wouldn't freeze. "Let's go, Alex," he said. They closed the door and drove away, the headlights illuminating the abandoned, shuttered houses. Sharon woke up feeling eerily cold. She struggled to open her eyes and felt a severe headache. Trying to get up, she fell back onto the bed, feeling completely powerless. "Where am I?" the woman thought. There were wooden walls all around, and faint daylight shone through the boarded-up windows. It took a while to realize that she was in her parents' house. How she'd gotten here, she didn't understand. Landlords. "Is anyone there?" There was a man's voice outside and a knock on the door. Sharon tried to answer, but she had trouble even speaking. "Hey," the voice shouted again. "I'm here," she said in a hoarse whisper, feeling a burning pain in her throat. The door opened, and a man with a gray beard, dressed in a warm jacket and winter hat, appeared on the threshold. Seeing the woman lying on the bed under a pile of things, he immediately ran over to her. "Who are you? What's the matter with you?" he asked, patting Sharon's cheeks. "Are you all right?" "It's cold," she whispered. "Wait, let me help you." The man grabbed another blanket, wrapped it around Sharon, took off his jacket and covered her with it, tucking it under her side. "How did you end up here? No one's been here in so many years." She stared at him, unable to get a word out and trying to understand what had happened. The man had heard about Sharon's condition and had rushed out of the house, wearing only a sweater, to return with firewood. He returned a minute later, indeed with firewood, and immediately started heating the stove, promising to make the house warm soon. He asked Sharon to wait just a little while. In a few minutes, the wood in the stove was already crackling, and Alevtina could see the glow of scarlet flames through the gap in the stove door, which was no longer closed so tightly. "I see that you have decided to settle here thoroughly," said Steve, looking at the contents of the bags on the table. "How much groceries did you bring?" As Sharon gradually warmed up and came to her senses, she realized that Kevin had brought her here to keep her. She was resisting his wedding and demanding her money back, which he was apparently trying to avoid. The stranger, meanwhile, placed a cloth backpack on a chair and pulled out a thermos of hot tea, which he offered to Sharon. "Here you go. It's delicious," he said, helping her up. "Thank you," the woman said, taking a few sips. "What kind of tea is this?" "I make it myself. It's rosehip, hawthorn, and some other herbs," the man replied. "Are you feeling better?" "Yes, almost better." The man went on to tell how he had noticed car tracks and human footprints leading to the house, and how he had decided to check who had arrived. "Who are you?" Sharon asked, feeling better after her tea. "Oh, forgive me, you old fool," the man apologized. "I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Steve, the local forester." "Steve. How strange," Sharon said thoughtfully. "Why strange?" The man didn't understand. Now that the house was warm from the logs burning in the stove, they warmed not only Sharon's body but also her soul. The woman looked around the room and noticed the colored wallpaper that had almost completely peeled away from the walls, reminding her of the old days. The ceiling of the house was still intact, and the old curtains her mother had once sewn still swayed lightly on the windows. Sharon began to share her memories with Steve. "This is my home. You see, I grew up here, lived with my parents, then went to the city to study, and stayed there. My dad's name was Steve, too, and he was a woodsman back then. Everybody in the neighborhood respected him. He was a very good man." Steve was surprised at the coincidence and laughed. "So I'm a forester too, Steve, like your father." "Wow, what a coincidence. I never would have guessed. I heard there used to be a very nice man who was a forester, but I didn't know we were namesakes." Noticing Sharon's hard look, Steve took her hand and said, "Don't jump to conclusions. Things happen in life." He stood up and said confidently, "If you're going to stay here, you're going to have to clean up. And I'll help you, if you don't mind." Sharon smiled. Who wouldn't want help under these circumstances? "Thank you." So they spent the day tidying up the house together. Steve removed the boards that had been used to board up the windows and fixed the doors. Sharon took over the cleaning, soaped the floors and windows, and was about to wash the old curtains. Steve stopped her, arguing that the old stuff shouldn't be hung back up in the house. "So what am I going to do without curtains?" she asked. "We'll put up new ones," Steve said confidently. "Where will we get them from?" Sharon wondered. "If we look hard enough, we'll find them," Steve answered cryptically, and Sharon shrugged her shoulders, not knowing how he would do it. But his confidence and willingness to help unselfishly brought her comfort and hope in her time of need. Sharon watched Steve closely, not understanding what brought him to these parts. After all, he was not a local. But despite these thoughts, they became friends. Steve came to Sharon's house every day, helping her with her household chores, fixing old furniture, and fetching water. In return, Sharon delighted him with home-cooked meals. "Some of the houses have lights on, people living. I guess they're leaving," she inquired of Steve. "There are a dozen houses left," he replied. "Mostly lonely old people who don't want children are left here. They keep cattle, plant vegetable gardens, go to the woods for berries and mushrooms. They fish in the lake. Steve said there are TVs, but the connection can be unstable, especially in the winter. The woman then rose from the table and walked over to the closet that held the things Kevin had haphazardly thrown into bags. There she found her card, which was supposed to receive funds from work and retirement. Here she held the card out to Steve. "This is my card." "What's this?" the man didn't understand. "It's my bank card," Sharon explained. "It's supposed to have money transferred to it. Maybe I can even get some handle on it here." Her voice sounded hopeful that modern technology would allow her, even in this secluded village, to have access to the tools and information she needed. Sharon folded her palms at her chest and spoke languorously. "I beg of you, let's go to the store and buy me a TV, please." Steve hesitated for a moment. The nearest store is about 80 kilometers away. The trip there and back would take all day, he pondered aloud. But Sharon's look was so earnest and pleading that he couldn't refuse her. "Okay, we'll go tomorrow in my car," the man agreed. Sharon smiled happily. She was growing to like this sturdy man with a soulful name who reminded her so much of her father. 2 months passed. Summer came. One warm evening, Steve and Sharon were having tea in the yard. The forester had made a small table, and Sharon had decorated it with a crocheted tablecloth. All around them the trees were quietly humming, pleasing them with their peace. Sharon suddenly thought and realized that nothing in life happens for nothing. She probably should have come back here a long time ago. Sharon, Steve addressed. "You and I aren't young anymore, but I feel full of energy here. There never seems to be a dull moment in this place." "What's there to be bored about?" "I'll finish the vegetable garden soon. Then we can tend it," replied Sharon. "That's true. A vegetable garden is a good thing. But that's not what I mean," the man continued. "Anyway, Sharon, let's live together." The woman was astonished and at the same time fascinated by the suggestion. "That's the way we practically stay together anyway, Steve," she said. "I mean, let's live together, run the household together, and watch your shows in the evenings," Steve explained. Suddenly Sharon held out her hand to him and smiled. "Come on, Steve. It really is more fun together." Happy, Steve hugged Sharon tightly, pulled her close to him and stroked her gray hair affectionately. One day, returning from the woods, Steve brought a small kitten into the house. The animal was injured, looking weak, almost lifeless. "What's wrong with him?" Steve, Sharon asked, setting aside a basin of washed laundry. "Caught in a trap. Wild little thing. Apparently the poachers are at it again," he said with concern in his voice. "It took a kitten rescue." Sharon was surprised at its size. "Wow, a kitten. It's bigger than a healthy cat." "Bring the first aid kit, please," Steve asked. He carefully treated the wound on the young bobcat's paw and impromptu applied a bandage with ointment, then gave it a new name. "Let her live with us, and then we'll see." For the lynx, who was now called Rosinka, they adapted an old dog box. They had to replace the damaged boards and build an enclosure from metal mesh. In honor of the former owner of the box, the lynx was renamed Mukhtar. Despite its wild nature, the new pet turned out to be unusually affectionate, licking Alevtina's hand when she stroked it or changed bandages. A few days later, Steve brought a large box of chicks into the house. "Here are the laying hens," he proudly announced, showing the find to Sharon. At the bottom of the box, a chain of chickens waddled merrily. "Now we'll always have fresh eggs." "Geez, Steve, but where are we going to keep them all?" Sharon exclaimed, motioning with her hands. "That's not a problem," Steve replied quickly. "I'll start building the chicken coop tomorrow morning, and then we'll build the stable. We'll have a cow, goats, geese, and even piglets. We'll have a full-fledged farm of our own." Sharon just nodded, smiled, and did not hide her joy. Setting up a home for the new animals was not a difficult task for Steve. He didn't skimp on the construction, and soon there were several buildings in the yard: a barn, a chicken coop, a pen for geese and ducks, and a brand new bathhouse. Sharon was overjoyed when the first smoke came from the new chimney. "In time we'll renovate the house too. As long as we have the strength, we can do it all," Steve promised. They began to go to town to collect money from the card and Steve's salary once a month. At the same time, at the market they gave away their produce, eggs, milk, and meat. The prices were low, but they didn't want to trade on their own. They had to get back to farming. After making the necessary purchases, they went home. On one such day, returning along a forest road, they noticed a car standing on the side of the road. "It's not ours. Must be some tourists," Steve suggested and pulled up next to the unfamiliar car. "Hello. Need any help?" Steve asked, approaching the car on the side of the road. "Good evening," echoed a man in his late 40s. "Trouble is, the car's broken down. No matter how hard I try, it won't start." "Let's see what we can do," Steve suggested and looked under the hood of the foreign car. After twisting a few wires and looking at the engine, he concluded, yes, it's a serious matter. It needs repairing. "But where to find a repair shop around here?" the man asked anxiously. "I looked on the navigator. There are no settlements nearby." Two boys of about 10 years old ran out of the car, followed by a woman. Steve looked at the family and said firmly, "Let's go to our place. You'll spend the night and we'll tow you to service in the morning. I'll get the rope." After the men hitched the foreign car with the cable to the car, everyone took their seats and Steve carefully dragged the car up to the village. "Here we are," Sharon said as she greeted the guests. She led the woman and children into the house. The guests turned out to be visitors from far away who wanted to see the local beauty, but their plans were disrupted by a car breakdown. "My name is Sandra," the woman introduced herself. "And these are our sons, Pashka and Kolka." The boys were surprised by Mukhtar the lynx, and they looked at the animal with interest, and everything around them seemed unusual and exciting to them. Toward evening, everyone gathered around a large table outside. Steve and Martin, Sandra's husband, took care of the brazier on which the meat was roasting, while the women worked with the vegetables and herbs. Steve poured moonshine. "Here's to getting acquainted, to meeting, and to getting your car fixed quickly," he said, and everyone drank a toast to that. The evening was warm and pleasant. When Sandra put the children to bed, they had barely made it to their beds. The adults continued to socialize over tea with forest herbs. The next day, Martin's car was taken away for service, and it became clear that the car would not be ready until tomorrow, so the homecoming for the guests was postponed. The presence of Sandra and her family greatly enlivened the household. The boys spent the day with the animals, feeding carrots to the rabbits, carrying hay for the cow, collecting eggs in the hen house, and then drinking steaming milk. Martin and Steve really got busy with the firewood, sawing logs and stacking them in a neat row. The women, meanwhile, were preparing lunch. After finishing the day's chores, everyone went to the lake where they swam and had fun on the boat. On their return, a hot bath was waiting for everyone, a true pleasure after an active day. When it was time to say goodbye, the guests were full of thanks. "Thank you so much. It was a great weekend." Sandra, Martin, and the boys never tired of praising the wonderful time they had had, and they promised to come back with friends. "Come and visit us again," Steve said happily, shaking Martin's hand. "No doubt we will, and not alone. We'll bring friends," Steve promised, and soon their car was out of sight. Left alone with Sharon, Steve said thoughtfully, "I think it's time to build the guest houses." And so, as time went on, Sharon tended the vegetable garden and prepared the winter's bounty, and Steve began to work on the addition to the house. The farm was expanding, the work was getting bigger and bigger, and life was booming. One evening, as they were finishing their work in the vegetable garden, they noticed several cars approaching. "Who's that?" "You see," Sharon said, perplexed. "We'll find out now," said Steve, and headed for the gate. Walking towards him was Martin with an enthusiastic shout and questions about his health. After a hearty hug, Martin asked for hospitality for a week. "Why do you ask?" "We'll be glad to have such guests," Steve cheerfully retorted, clapping Martin on the shoulder. But Martin made it clear that he had not come alone. "Who else is with you?" asked the forester, suspecting it might be the friends Martin had mentioned during the farewell. And here they were, welcoming the visitors, happy to meet and make new acquaintances, which promised to enliven their quiet corner even more. "Is all this coming to us, or what?" Sharon suddenly asked, looking at the arriving crowd. "Yeah, see guests," Steve replied with a smile. "We'll deal with it." People started pouring out of the cars, men, women, children. Sharon only had time to catch her breath as young women surrounded her, shaking her hand and calling her name. "Where do you want me to carry your things and groceries?" they asked. "To the house, girls, to the house," Sharon replied, a little confused. Gradually, the bustle subsided as if it had never happened. The women got busy cooking and the men set up a few tents in the yard. What clever people, Sharon thought to herself. The children had their sleeping places in the house, and the adults were settled outside. The noise and fun, and the joy of the children's ringing voices filled Sharon and Steve's house, which had seemed quiet in the morning. All week the children enjoyed helping to feed the animals, going to the lake with their parents, and playing outside the gate. The women helped Sharon, even though she tried to discourage them, because they were all here on vacation. The men had enough to do all day, and everything brought them joy and pleasure. Steve had even organized a hunting trip for the guests, and the fishing trip had been a real success. As a farewell, Sharon gathered gifts for the guests: socks and mittens made of rabbit wool, jam from wild berries, pickled mushrooms, pickles and smoked fish they had caught themselves. A long goodbye and strong hugs left no doubt that everyone had become close friends during that week. And when the town folks left, Sharon found money and a card in her room under the tablecloth wishing her well and hoping to see her again. "Look, made the first money on their farm," Steve said cheerfully, smiling. He felt that the house would soon be filled with guests again, and he was not mistaken. A week later, another group arrived. "The vacation here is a notable one," a man named Gordon announced as he entered the yard. "A good vacation," Steve nodded and invited the guests in. "Come on in the yard." No matter how many years passed, Steve and Sharon's home became known for its hospitality. From May through September, tourists from various cities would come to stay with them for a day or two, and sometimes a week. Steve managed to build several summer houses, bought 2 boats, and put in a boiler. People from megalopolises and noisy cities liked to relax surrounded by wild, untouched nature. The hosts did not ask for payment for accommodation and did not set any tariffs because the guests helped them in many ways. But the tourists always left money, which Steve invested in new buildings, the purchase of fodder for livestock, and other necessary things. That day they were waiting for the next guests. "Look, someone's coming," Steve shouted to the woman. "I think it's ours." A black Jeep stopped at the gate, and a man got out. He looked in amazement at the good house with the beautiful carved plat bands, at the linux and the corral. "You won't answer that." "The son of this mine has arrived," Sharon said quietly, covering her eyes from the sun with her hand. She took a few steps forward, smiled, and bowed her head. "Hello, son," she greeted. The sight of a healthy, gaunt, and cheerful mother made Kevin's legs give out. He hugged his mother and cried. Sharon stroked her son's head and said in a quiet voice the words Steve had once said to her. "This is our homeland here, son, our native forest. It has some kind of ancestral memory. Takes care of those who were born and raised under its pines. Everything will be all right. I know it will." David walked slowly up the white steps, some of them cracked from time. The bank of the Sosnovsky River running through the city was high. To get to the embankment, one had to climb several flights of stairs. David was getting chilly tangled up in his old down jacket. Here by the river the temperature was much lower than in the city. It felt distinctly like winter was approaching. David pulled his knitted hat over his ears. He couldn't get sick. If he got sick, he'd have no money to pay for a bed in the hostel, no money to buy groceries. Not to mention medication. Because the life of a homeless person is like that. David has known much worse times. I had to sleep on a heating main and look for food in a garbage dump. It was a lot, but I managed to make it through, to more or less organize my life and everyday life. Of course, we are still far away from the fulfillment of our main dream, the purchase of our own home, but it is already much better than it was. David grew up in a small village. Surrounding the place were groves of aspen trees, especially picturesque in the fall. Little David, as a kindergartner, tried to draw them, these beautiful trees. And then, as he grew older, he also tried to transfer what he saw to paper. But nothing worked out. It seems that he lacked talent. Childhood is the happiest and coziest time of David's life. A grown man often recalled his early years with nostalgia. And it was not even that. At that time he had a roof over his head, his own bed with clean linen, a guaranteed bowl of soup every day. It's that he was loved then. He wasn't alone. Grandma, sweet, kind Grandma Melissa Wise. It seemed to David for a long time that she was omnipotent. It was Grandma who always found the right words to dispel her grandson's sadness and anxiety. She was the one who understood what to do in any given situation. She was respected by her neighbors. She seemed to know everything in the world. Also, Grandma was never tired. At least David couldn't remember her sleeping. When he went to bed, Grandma was still doing chores, and when David woke up, she was up and about. The smiling grandmother was a sturdy woman. She was tall, statuesque, and energetic. She could not sit idle. She always found something to do, and worked, and kept the household and raised her grandson. Yes, a grandmother. This woman did not look like a gray-haired old woman in a sharp scarf. No, David's grandmother was still young. That's how he remembered her. Energetic, active, businesslike. Later, David sorely missed his grandmother's gaze, her warm embrace, her gentle, lulling voice. He sobbed at the impossibility of changing everything. Blaming himself, screaming helplessly into the void. Hopelessness. That's how David would characterize his condition. It was not terrible to lose the house. The guy at that time, this moment, he was almost not interested. The main thing was that his grandmother was no longer there. David had no other relatives. It just so happened. Grandmother Melissa came to their village as a young girl after her husband, whose name was also David, by the way. The grandson was named after his grandfather. He was a good man, kind, hardworking, and skillful. And at work, at the sawmill, he was appreciated and neighbors respected. But David S.R. grew up in an orphanage. He didn't know his family. That's why, probably, he dreamed of creating a strong, big family. Once he went to work in a village, located almost 100 kilometers away. There he met a beautiful, modest girl, Melissa. And that's how it turned out that they ended up getting married. Melissa and David began to live as a family. David worked at his sawmill and Melissa took a job on the farm as a milkmaid. Everything was fine, everything was fine, everything was fine, everything was fine. They lived soul to soul. Both spouses dreamed of a large family and at least 5 children. But it didn't happen. A daughter, Becca, was born to the couple. The young parents did not intend to stop at this achievement, but the years passed, and Becca remained the only child in the family. The girl grew up beautiful, not like her mother, not like her father. Those were simple, country people, and this was a white bone. Fine features, fragile figure, huge violet-colored eyes and golden curls. A princess, indeed. The locals joked about whether Melissa had taken such a pretty girl out on the town, but David had no doubts about his wife's fidelity. The man didn't know his relatives, and rightly assumed that his daughter had taken after one of them, one of his relatives. This was most likely the case. The character of the girl corresponded to her appearance, then smart, capricious, self-loving. And when Becca grew up a little and realized that she had a favorable appearance, so she was proud. Becca's parents were simple and hard-working people. Their family lived no worse and no better than others, but Becca was sure that she deserved more. She dreamed of living in a big city and blamed her parents for not bothering to move there in their time. She demanded toys from her mother and father, then outfits and jewelry. She refused to do housework, reasoning that she was not going to stay in the countryside for long and needed to study, not sweep floors. Except Becca didn't learn. Or rather, she did study, but not at all what they taught in school. She bought magazines and tried to make herself look like one of the models that appeared on the pages of glossy magazines. She did makeup, washed and painted a new face again, achieving the perfect result. I learned how to combine closet items correctly, to make different hairstyles out of my golden hair. And it all started around the age of 12. Maybe even a little earlier. I'll go to the city, become a photo model, maybe even go abroad, but I won't live in a shithole like you. Melissa and David looked at each other confused. They both blamed themselves for their daughter's behavior. But what had they done wrong? Melissa herself had grown up in absolute poverty and had even starved. That's why, probably, she tried to please her only daughter, and she was so beautiful. David did not know parental love at all and was brought up in an orphanage. What can be said? The man spoiled, of course, long awaited his child. And yet both spouses tried to instill basic moral principles in Becca. By their example, they showed that it is necessary to work. It is necessary to treat others with respect. Melissa taught her daughter to bake pies and clean the house. But the girl rejected her parents' attitudes from childhood and showed that she dreamed of a completely different life. And when she became a teenager, David and Melissa heard a lot of things about themselves. They were losers and people who thought nothing of life. "You have no right to teach me," Becca shouted at her mother and father as they tried to get her to learn to help them with their chores. "You have no right. You haven't accomplished anything on your own." One of them works in a sawmill for a penny. The other one shovels manure in a barn. "I'm not like you. I want to live differently, and I will. I'll marry a rich man or become a model." "Who will marry you? Such an inept girl." Her father tried to talk some sense into Becca. "You don't know how to cook or clean. Your mother still serves you." "I'm not going to marry a village fool, but a rich one. They have servants for all that." There was nothing the parents could do to change Becca's mind. She became more and more capricious and more angry. She didn't want to study. She didn't help around the house. The only thing she had to do was to look at fashion magazines and spend time on the street with her friends. By the way, Becky had a lot of admirers on the street, but of course for such a beautiful girl. And it was not only boys' classmates, but also grown-up guys. That's what scared Melissa the most. They had conversations with her daughter, but she just laughed in their faces. David tried to be tough, locking up his wayward daughter at home, so that no harm would come to her. But Becca always escaped through the window, or waited for a moment when her mother and father were distracted, and then ran out the door. She wanted company. She wanted to see admiring glances, to hear compliments. All this fueled her self-confidence. Her confidence in her own irresistibility made her even more convinced that she was worthy of some mythical, better life. And the beautiful girl dreamed of getting into another life the easy way. She was not interested in studying at school and then at university. The girl thought that it was too long and difficult. It was for those who were unlucky enough to be born a beauty with huge violet eyes and golden curls. Growing up, David was told about all this by a neighbor, Grandma Lassie. She called his mother Becca a tale. Grandma never spoke ill of his mother, only sighed about her fate. Well, she also blamed herself for missing her daughter somewhere, for neglecting her. But Grandma Lassie cut the whole truth at once and didn't try to soften the edges. "Your mother was beautiful, but she was lazy. She wasn't very smart either. She wanted to fly high, didn't have the brains to do the math. So it turned out the way it did. It wasn't her grandparents' fault. They did everything for their daughter. They're good people. It's probably just genes from David's family. He grew up in an orphanage. Who puts their kids in an orphanage like that? The ones who don't, and only kids like Becca. If it wasn't for your grandmother, you'd have had to grow up in an orphanage too." Becca was barely 18 when she left her parents' house, and not to study in the city, like many other village boys and girls, but to follow her fiancé. A guy from the city, a student, came to their village once, together with a local boy. His buddy had come to see his parents, so he brought his classmate with him. The groom's name was Buddy. He was also a university student and already drove his own car, given by his father on his coming of age. Buddy was handsome and stylish, just like an actor from a youth show. Naturally, Becca immediately met him. The rustic beauty charmed the young man, and the two had a lightning-fast affair. It was Buddy who took Becca to the city. They started living together in his apartment. Buddy was studying. Becca was studying home economics. Buddy and Becca lived a well-to-do fun life thanks to the money of the young man's father. Went to clubs and restaurants, even went on a trip. Naturally, David went to town and tried to bring his wayward daughter home. He realized what was going on, but she flatly refused to go. And there was nothing he could do, because Becca was already 18. So she had the right to run her own life as she saw fit. Becca had already spent too much time in the village. Her parents got her a job as a clerk at the local store, since she didn't want to study. Becca was angry at her fate, at her father and mother, at the local village priests who could not fulfill her dreams. Her parents kept her from running away to the city, even to nowhere. They were endlessly urging her to get smart, lecturing her, controlling their adult daughter, explaining it all with fear for her future. Becca would have run away from them without a second thought. But where to and for what money? The girl tried to send her photos to a modeling agency, but to her own surprise, she didn't get any answers. And she thought that the offers would fall on her like a cornucopia. Only, it seems, no such luck. Becca kept thinking about the plan, chatting on dating sites, receiving tons of compliments and offers, but she was afraid. She hadn't seen these people in person. There's no telling who might be there on the other side of the monitor. Her parents had planted these fears in her, for which Becca hated them even more. And that's when Buddy showed up, a prince in a black Audi. He rescued the beauty from captivity, took her away from the hated, dirty village, poor parents, moralizing. That's how Becca perceived her departure. She escaped, broke free. It didn't work out with Buddy, so he quickly found someone else. But Becca was in no hurry to return to the village. She got a new beau of lower status than Buddy's major, but nothing. That relationship didn't work out either, but a new one loomed ahead. Becca lowered the bar in the choice of suitors. Suitors changed one after another. One thing remained unchanged. The girl lived at the expense of these people, gave them her tenderness, youth, beauty, and in return received a roof over her head, food, some gifts, trips to cafes and clubs. Becky's life wasn't exactly what she'd dreamed of, but she wasn't going back to the village. David and Melissa were heartbroken to see what their daughter was becoming. Her once golden curls had faded, her voice rough and hoarse, her skin an unhealthy color. Becca drank a lot, started smoking. All this, naturally, affected both her health and her appearance. David was very worried about the path his only daughter had taken, such a huge shock for her father. Melissa hoped that Becca would get her mind right and get over it. She'd had enough of living with one man and another, and they were not such wealthy and handsome young men as Buddy. They were more like wrinkled men of marginal appearance, but they worked somewhere, so they had money, and Becca lived in the city at the expense of her admirers. From the golden curls of Princess Becca and herself had turned into a gray woman with signs of disadvantage in her appearance. It was hard to imagine that she had once looked so different. She had dreamed of a rich, beautiful life, spent hours and hours perfecting her makeup. Becca was going downhill fast and didn't seem to notice it at all. She felt quite happy and did not want to return to her parents' village. David's heart ached for his daughter, literally. The man had suffered 2 heart attacks in a row. Melissa was worried too, of course, but in her heart she hoped that everything would work out. Becca was still young, but David seemed to have realized that nothing good would come out of Becca. David didn't survive the 3rd heart attack, so Melissa was left all alone in the village house. No husband, daughters living the high life in the city. Well, that's not exactly how Melissa pictured her old age. At least she had a job. She still worked as a milkmaid on the farm. That's socializing, that's life. And at home? Loneliness, cold 4 walls. On New Year's Eve, an unprecedented event happened. Becca came to visit her mother in the village. When Melissa saw her dear guest, she immediately began to organize and prepare the table. The daughter looked unwell, walking pale. When Becca took off her jacket, Melissa gasped. Her round belly was tucked under her sweater. Becca was pregnant. Apparently, she'd been pregnant for a long time. It turned out that the father of the baby is another of Becca's suitors, a trucker. He rented an apartment in the city, earned good money, had enough to live on, and to get drunk when the husband was not on a voyage. The pregnancy, of course, was not planned, it just happened. After learning about what happened, the admirer was frightened, admitted that in another city he already has a family wife and 2 children. He does not need heirs on the side. Gave him money to solve the problem, but Becca was turned down at the hospital. All the terms were out, and there were no indications for termination, as the child was developing well. It was surprising, considering the fact that Becca, being pregnant, did not deny herself a drink. What happened next was ridiculously trivial. The admirer ran away, his heels glistening. Becca lived in their apartment for a few more months until the lease expired. But she had nowhere to go. Who wanted her? She couldn't get another suitor, so she returned to her nest. Melissa hoped things would work out for them now. And the fact that the child wouldn't have a father was no big deal. She'd manage, she'd grow up, she'd learn, she'd get back on her feet. The woman hoped that Becky would awaken the maternal instinct of motherhood. She would change and make her softer, more loving and caring. It didn't work out. Becca barely survived to give birth in the hated village. By the way, the baby was born prematurely, weak and very small. He was raised for almost a month in Kuwait. Becca immediately wrote a refusal on her son. She didn't need him. And here he was premature and obviously sick. In general, she gave up the child in the maternity hospital and went back to the city. Now she could live again in her own. Pleasure to go to cafes and restaurants in search of a new love, to have fun without a potbelly, all better, all easier. When Melissa learned of her daughter's behavior, she rushed to the maternity hospital and explained the situation to the people. She was understood and the rejection papers were destroyed. Melissa's neighbor's niece worked there as the head doctor. That's how it was resolved through her. But we had to look for Becca. In order to draw up the documents for the baby, his mother had to be present and sign them. Becca, at first, insisted that she didn't need her son and that it would be better for him to go to an orphanage. But Melissa convinced her daughter the boy should stay in the family. She made her case. "I'll take care of him. Don't worry. Live as you please. But you'll get an allowance for him and not a small one. You're a single mom, right?" Melissa took this step for the sake of her grandson. Her daughter persuaded her thanks to child benefits. Otherwise, Becca would never have agreed to keep the baby, and Melissa would not have been given custody. And the conditions are not ideal, and the age is already considerable. That's how little David stayed with his grandmother. David knew his mother, his beautiful Becca, only from the stories of his grandmother, neighbors, and their photos. The woman was not interested in the child's fate. So came sometimes to his mother to lie down, to rest between the next complex novels. What remained in David's memory was what? Some vague image. A woman who smelled pungent, hoarsely noisy, unpleasant. She was yelling at his grandmother, demanding something from her, and little David was scared. But of course, David could not remember his parents well, because Becky was gone when he was barely 4. Another roommate in a drunken brawl had miscalculated his strength. And, well, in general, the outcome of Becky's life was very natural. The grandmother told David many times that she had survived that period, after Becky was gone, only because of her little grandson, who had to be taken care of. David and his grandmother lived poorly. Times were hard, and a milkmaid's salary did not imply luxury and excesses, but David still considered his childhood happy. Energetic, strong, caring grandmother friends, soft bed, the aroma of pies and fried potatoes. Yes, David didn't have an expensive computer, consoles, brand-name sneakers. What else is considered the ultimate joy among teenage children? But he never went hungry, and he never wore new clothes. David tried to help his grandmother in everything. As he grew older, he realized that life was not easy for his dear and beloved. The restless boy tried to please her as much as he could. True, but to study did not work well. His grandmother practiced with him, tried to explain to him complex topics, but something in his head did not add up, and that's it. It's because Becca drank when she carried him, asserted Grandma Lassie, Grandma's neighbor. They were sitting in the kitchen drinking tea and thought David couldn't hear anything. "Yes, but it doesn't matter," waved her grandmother's hand. "The main thing is that he's healthy, strong, and kind. Not everyone has to be a scientist. And David will find his place in life. He's so handy." Grandpa, I guess. David was really ready to fix something, to make it for him. And no one had taught him how to do it on purpose. He watched other people do it. He picked it up on the fly, not like math. By the time David finished school, the financial situation of their small family had deteriorated, with the farm paying a pittance. His grandmother's pension was also very small, especially compared to the ever-increasing prices. David worked part-time, mending neighbors' fences and mowing people's grass, digging potatoes, even helping with the construction of houses. But these earnings were not regular and small. With the grades that were showing in David's certificate, it was not worth thinking about going to college, much less to university. But the boy still decided to go to the city. There are more opportunities to earn, to settle in life. And his grandmother needed financial help. She was already pulling his weight. Go, Melissa said yes. "You're a serious guy with a backbone. I'm not as worried about you as I was about Becca. You won't be lost, you won't stray from the straight and narrow. Just be careful, you're still young, and there are so many dangers out there." "Don't worry," Grandma. David put his arm around Grandma's shoulders. "Everything will be fine. I'll go to the construction site as a laborer. I know how to knead cement, lay bricks and paint plaster. Anyway, I'll definitely find a use for me there. I'll earn money for an apartment, and I'll take you in right away." Grandmother smiled, but her eyes were still sad for some reason. Even though she said David wouldn't be lost, she apparently still had a premonition of trouble. The city at first stunned and even deafened David. Crowds of people rushing somewhere, streams of cars. No, the guy, of course, had been to the city before. But it was one thing to come here with his grandmother to go shopping or to do some paperwork. And quite another to be here for a long time, alone, to become a resident of this noisy metropolis. Where to start? Where to go? David found several advertisements in advance back in the village. Construction sites often needed workers. So he decided to give it a try. A young handy guy was gladly hired to build another supermarket. The site was almost ready. The finishing work was still to be done. The team was running out of time, and they needed helpers. David was a good fit. He was even provided with a roof over his head carriage house. True, he had to share it with the workers, but it was nothing, but it was free. After receiving the first money, David immediately rented an apartment. He wanted to start looking for a job again, but the job found him. One of the workers who lived with David in the apartment called him to a new site. "They'll pay well," the bearded man assured me. "We'll make a calculation based on the results, and then we'll get the money." David did not object to this arrangement. He had money set aside from his previous earnings, so he didn't really worry about how he was going to live all this time. The work was progressing, and David was anticipating that he would soon have some good money. Then he could send some of it to his grandmother. He knew she had debts, borrowing from neighbors to send her grandson to the city. She was afraid to let the guy go without any money in his pocket. Soon he would pay her back everything, with a raise, and she would be happy. It didn't work out. This time, the owners simply screwed the workers. Or maybe it was the bearded man who took David's money and ran away with it. Maybe he was the cheater, realized David was green, naive. It was useless to contact the police or the labor inspectorate. There were no official agreements or contracts with the workers, and no one would take their word for it. David was in a desperate situation. The money he had put aside had run out. He had no money to pay his rent, and there was almost no money left for bread. The guy spent days running around the city looking for work. As luck would have it, unskilled laborers were not needed anywhere. One day, after another unsuccessful attempt to get a job at a construction site, David was walking towards the bus stop. He was filled with a whole range of unpleasant feelings: fear, despair, resentment. And then he was called. "You looking for a job?" David turned around. Behind him were two guys in their mid-20s, tall, tanned. Obviously, they were laborers from the construction site. They work on the street. That's why they had tanned faces and broad palms, glowing with mud. "I'm looking," David nodded. "Why?" "Just because we need help. It's not a big deal. It's one thing to unload into a car, but it pays well." A doubt crept into David's soul. What if it was a hoax again? He didn't want to step on the same rake again. He wanted to try to get an official job, but there was no way out. He had to stay in town to find a job. To do that, he had to pay rent, he had to have money for food, so he decided to take a risk. "I'm with you," he said. "So we'll meet here tonight at 11. 11 o'clock. David clarified. It seemed strange. Why so late? "The owners are leaving late. We'll go in after them, start taking everything out. They don't want to be involved in all this fuss. That's why they pay well." David shrugged. The rich have their quirks. "I'll be there," he promised his new acquaintances. At the allotted time, David was in place. The guys he'd arranged with in the afternoon were late. Or maybe they wouldn't show up at all. David wouldn't be too upset. Sure, he needed the money, but these men looked too suspicious. In sincerity, there was a falseness about them. David kept thinking they would cheat him, not pay him, like the bearded man. But the guys showed up, a few minutes late, but they came. Or rather, they came. When an old, broken down, open-body truck pulled into the parking lot. David didn't even look at it, didn't even think it was behind him. But the driver's door swung open, and one of David's daytime companions looked out. "What are you standing there for? Hop in. We're already late." David obeyed and settled into the seat next to the driver. The other guy was here, too. He said a discreet hello and stared out the window again. Unlike his buddy, this other guy was silent and frowning. They drove for a long time, almost an hour, first through the city, then on the highway, then on a country road. The whole thing seemed increasingly suspicious to David, but he realized that at this point there was no quick and easy way out. At best, these two would drop him off at night without a dime in his pocket somewhere outside of town. At worst, he didn't even want to think about that. The driver joked and smiled from time to time. David had a strong feeling that he was trying to appear calm and relaxed to himself, but he was worried. The other was silent, as usual. He didn't react to his friend's words, just stared at the road. Finally, the truck stopped near a plot of land demolished by a high fence. The driver opened the gate with a key. David exhaled. As long as he had his keys, everything was really okay. "You stay in the yard. We're going in." The driver ordered us. "We'll give you the boxes. You'll put them in the truck. It won't take long." The boys disappeared into the house. David noted that they had a key to the front door, too. It was silent and dark, the kind of darkness that only happens in the country. Large stars peered down from the sky. David involuntarily admired the night sky. He remembered his native village, thought of his grandmother. I wondered what she was doing now. Probably drinking tea with Grandma Lassie in the cozy kitchen. And old women always talk about him, about David. I wanted to go home to the only person I knew. I wanted to be a little boy again, with his grandmother as a loving and all-powerful being. David was torn from his pleasant thoughts by the driver's hoarse voice. "What are you dreaming about?" Standing there like a pillar, "Take the box." David obediently dragged the container to the truck as agreed. The box was heavy. I wondered what was inside the book. Utensils? Maybe just some household stuff. No sooner had David returned to the front porch than the silence of the September night was broken by the wail of a police siren. The darkness was struck by the glow of a flashing beacon. David had hoped that the police cars would drive past the lot to the scene, but they stopped right outside the gate. The next thing happened quickly. David's brain recorded separate images. The garden was filling up with uniformed men, some of them rushing into the house, some of them starting to search the plot. David is thrown to the ground as lightly as if he weighed nothing. His arms are twisted painfully behind his back, dry grass is tickling his face. Sand is stuffed into his nose and mouth. David sneezes once, then again, it's hard to breathe. Someone roughly turns David's face sideways. The boy gulps greedily for air. David is already sitting handcuffed on a hard bench with uniformed men nearby. No sign of the driver or the other guy. They seem to have escaped. This is the conclusion David draws from the scraps of phrases exchanged between the lawmen. "Where are your accomplices?" A stout man in camouflage speaks to David. "Do you know where they went?" David shakes his head negatively. He wants to explain to these people that the runaways are not his accomplices, that they met for the first time just this morning, that these guys just offered him a job. And David needed the money. But David was silent. First of all, you'd hardly believe him. The boy replayed his speech in his head and realized. It sounded very improbable. Secondly, his tongue became alien from fear, as if it were too big and clumsy. And my mouth was dry. He was very thirsty, but he didn't dare to ask the police for water. "Do you even know whose dacha you're going to rob?" The man in camouflage turned to the frightened guy again. "The prosecutor's house. I can feel it, you idiots. You're going to get the full brunt of it now." Then David was interrogated. The investigator, a middle-aged man with a tired, angry look, asked the guy questions like some hardened criminal. David told the truth. They didn't believe him, of course. No doubt about it. The two men had escaped, gone into hiding, and were being sought. David had assumed that the cops wouldn't succeed. Now he was sure that he had met experienced criminals. They'd probably get away with it. But what would happen to him? David was sent to the holding cell until morning. Black cell. A very special, indescribable odor. A calm and silent neighbor, not even interested in what David was in jail for. All day long, this big, scowling man would lie on his shelf and stare at the ceiling. Sometimes he was taken away, and then David was alone. It turned out that the truck in which the thieves had come to pick him up was stolen. They decided to pin this vehicle on David too. It was useless to explain to the men in uniform that David couldn't drive a car. He didn't have time to learn. "I don't even have a license. That's easy to check. We've got half the country driving without a license. That's no problem." The trial was held unexpectedly quickly. Only a few days after the arrest, the grandmother was present at the hearing. She had been informed in time. David didn't expect to see her. He was in the defendant's seat. All the evidence was against him. He was ashamed to look his grandmother in the eyes, even though David realized that he was not guilty of anything. But Grandma doesn't know. She must think he's a criminal. My grandmother looked thinner and somehow aged all at once. There were shadows under her eyes. There were more wrinkles, and her eyes were troubled, sad, but loving. She looked at David without judgment, with tenderness and love. It gave the boy strength. When the judge announced the verdict, David's eyes darkened. He knew he would not be acquitted, but he had hoped for a much lighter sentence. He even secretly wished for house arrest. He wasn't a repeat offender, after all. 8 years in a strict regime colony, the judge's verdict sounded ruthlessly. Grandma gasped, clutching her heart. So what is it? He's a kid. He's just a kid. The adult criminals confused him, tricked him, and then ran away. So David went to a colony in another region. The long gray days dragged on, one after another, like twins. Wake up, a meager breakfast, work in the industrial zone, a walk in the cramped prison yard, sometimes searches and inspections, lunch, dinner, periodic medical examinations, occasional holidays for the prisoners, the dreary monotony, the peculiar odor, the filth, the despair, the fear. David was always lucky with his neighbors. They were much more human than the guards. Each had his own complicated fate. David, as the youngest, was even pitied in his own way. They understood that it was bad luck for a young, naive guy to meet dangerous people on his way. David now had a lot of time to think. He was going through his universities, getting to know people, getting to know life. Now the boy clearly realized how naive and stupid he had been. David wouldn't fall for such a trick again. He would act differently. But you don't make a fist after a fight. Sometimes his grandmother came to visit David. At each visit, David noticed new wrinkles on her face. Her grandmother had aged. David knew that she now had heart problems, and he realized who was responsible for the illness of the native person. Of course, worries for his grandson did their job. Awarded the grandmother a serious illness. She needed an operation, but it cost money. And where to get it? David knew that the grandmother had tried several times to appeal for leniency for her grandson, even hired lawyers, except it didn't work. David answered to the full extent of the law, and only because the victims included a prosecutor, and such people are known to have great connections. How many times during those 8 years David had wished he could go back to that unfortunate day and refuse the offer of 2 strangers to earn money. His whole life would have been different then. "It's okay, grandson. Everything happens," his grandmother reassured him. David tried to be brave in front of her. But she saw everything, understood everything. "You've been duped. That's the way it is. The price is high, of course, but it's just the beginning of life. When you get out, we'll make up for it. Everything will be fine." David smiled. His grandmother's words made him feel lighter and warmer. And it really began to seem that everything would work out. The main thing was that he had a relative who loved him, who waited for him, who would never deceive or betray him. And then Grandma suddenly disappeared. David was worried when she didn't show up for his birthday. Usually she always showed up by that date, but there was no sign of her. His grandmother's phone didn't answer. David asked the guard's cell phone several times to make a call. There were also kind people among the guards, though they were not supposed to. They allowed the prisoners to make calls. But these calls were useless. Long beeps, that's all. And then David was finally called to the visiting room. The guy flew in on a wing. He was relieved. He imagined hugging his grandmother, telling her he missed her so much. But on the familiar gray sofa sat his neighbor, Grandma Lassie. She was tense, anxious. The boy felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He immediately realized that the worst had happened. "Batha Lassie?" David awkwardly hugged his neighbor. "How thin you've gotten. Don't they feed you here?" Then, in a broken voice, wiping her eyes now and then with her handkerchief, Grandma Lassie told David the terrible news. Melissa died. She had a heart attack, and the ambulance didn't get there in time. And how she wanted to wait for you, and what plans she made, sobbed Grandma Lassie. You could see that she hadn't yet come to terms with the loss of her neighbor's friend. She didn't wait. Neighbors arranged the funeral. I think someone was trying to get David to go see his grandmother. No way. It's not allowed. That's all. Not that they didn't let him go. They didn't even tell him about the tragedy. How come? How so? David muttered. How can I come home and she's gone? There's nowhere to go back to. Lassie looked at David confused. You don't know that, do you? Turns out that after David was locked up, Grandma Melissa had racked up loans. Thought good lawyers would get her favorite grandson out of jail. But it didn't work out, even with good lawyers. The loans were secured against the house. Accordingly, when the owner died, the bank took the property. It was another blow, far less sensitive than the first, but still. The house was not just a house, it was David's place of power. A quiet, cozy harbor with which the guy has a lot of pleasant associations, warm memories. And now what? Someone else is going to live there. Since then, David has felt lonely and needed by no one. No grandmother. Then why is he on this earth? What's his purpose? Before he thought to please his grandmother, to do his best for her, to strive for something. Now what's it all for? But you have to live somehow. So David adapted to the cold and the dark. I ate, slept, worked. Everything was automatic. In his head, he was constantly thinking of scenes from his childhood, where his grandmother was still very young and strong. And David promised her that he would support his grandmother in her old age. But the grandmother never lived to be old. Liberation did not bring the expected joy. Quite the opposite. Where to go, what to do, where to sleep, what to eat. There were more questions than answers. At least David had a small sum of money saved up over the years of working in the industrial zone. He went to the city with it. Where else? David realized that no one was waiting for him in the village. Even though Grandma Lassie said she was ready to take him in, she invited him to visit her after his release, but the boy realized that those were just polite words. Why would she want a criminal in her house? In the city, David spent money on hotel and food. The savings melted away in a week, and times were tough. There was a lot of things to deal with, like sleeping on the street, getting into street fights, and eating off the garbage. David got sick a couple times, so he thought he'd never make it. And he was even glad of such an outcome, but the young organism recovered again and again. And no one needed gray, dull, joyless life continued. David tried begging for alms. He got a serious beating for it. It turned out to be a whole business, and you can't enter it just by choice. The guy scavenged in garbage dumps. There was always food in the bins near restaurants and cafes. And in the city dump you could find clothes in season. David didn't even want to think about what he'd become. A dirty, ragged bum. His grandmother should have seen him. No, this wasn't what David had envisioned growing up like. He was disgusted with himself. One day David was walking past a house under construction and noticed that the foreman wasn't laying the tiles correctly. It turned out that not all the construction skills were out of his head yet. The foreman was surprised, looking at the homeless man incredulously. Then he took his advice, evaluated the result, smiled, and the unbelievable happened. David was offered a job. Of course, he jumped at the opportunity. The foreman's name was Beverly. He had his own little construction company. The guys did minor repairs and small constructions, and the crew needed smart guys. That's how David got the job. The pay, of course, was not much, but the man was happy about it. After so many years of hunger and wandering, a permanent job seemed a gift of fate. Beverly appreciated David for his diligence and dexterity. Over time, he learned the young man's story and helped him a little bit to get settled in life. For example, he told him that it was not necessary to rent a whole apartment or live in a hotel. It was too expensive. It is much more profitable in David's situation to spend the night in a hostel. It turns out that in the city there are such budget lodgings, huge rooms filled with bunk beds. To rent a bunk, a place for the night in such an establishment, cost a penny. Now David fell asleep in a warm bed. Dozens of neighbors snored around him, but it didn't bother the man, who was used to much harsher conditions. David had a job, he no longer slept outside. And Beverly, he had become something of a mentor to the man who had been thrown to the wayside. He helped him with paperwork, big purchases, hospitalization, and so on. Beverly advised David to start saving for his own place. You can't live in a hostel forever. A man needs his own corner. Even if not a luxury apartment, but at least a small one-bedroom in the middle of nowhere, so that there was a place to lay his head. And David began to save a little month by month. The man always kept his savings with him and made a secret pocket on his shirt. When Beverly found out about it, he grabbed his head. Are you crazy? Who does that? How? David didn't understand. Where should I leave them? Like burying a treasure in the ground in the woods. Not as a treasure, but as a deposit. I'll tell you what, we'll open a bank account. David was afraid to entrust his hard-earned money to the bank. He had been cheated more than once in his life, and quite cruelly. But Beverly had convinced him. And now homeless David even had his own account. The man replenished it with enviable regularity. The numbers in the account kept growing. Someday David would be able to realize his dream and buy a house or an apartment. Living in a hostel had its advantages. David often met all sorts of people, amazing fates, sometimes complicated, sometimes even scary. Lots of different stories. People in the hostel were like fellow travelers on trains, generously sharing details of their life stories with each other. It was fascinating. David regretted that he had never learned to read and write. If he had been able to write well, he would have published a thick collection of stories. People would be interested in reading about the lives of others. Some of the stories were a treasure trove of wisdom and experience. One day, a new neighbor took the bunk bed adjacent to David's bed. He was a man a little older than David himself. He did not come alone, but with a boy of about 6 years old. The child and the man looked uncannily alike. Identical green eyes with a slightly sly squint, copper red hair. Father and son. Stanford and Arthur, like most of the hostel's permanent residents, had a hard history. David recognized it on about the third or fourth day of his stay with the red-haired couple. Stanford, just like David, grew up in the village. He was raised by his mother. The man never knew his father. They lived poorly, but they didn't starve. There was always food in the house. His mother worked. Stanford studied, tried hard. He had a dream of becoming a lawyer. It seemed to the boy that people of this profession were practically heavenly beings. They helped to settle disputes, did justice, and, importantly, earned good money, so they could afford an apartment in a big city, a beautiful car, trips to the sea. You see, I wanted to take my mother to the sea, Stanford told David in a confidential whisper. The lights were already off in the room. The many bunks of the hostel were filled with the sound of snoring. Little Arthur, too, was asleep, curled up under the blanket. Stanford and David were having a conversation. A pleasant, almost friendly conversation. David told his neighbor about his fate, and it was somehow simple and natural. And Stanford responded with frankness to frankness. Stanford realized that it was hard for his mother to carry him alone. He dreamed of growing up sooner, of getting on his feet, of making her life a fairy tale. Mama had never been to the sea. She couldn't pay for such a trip, but she dreamed of going. Stanford, however, watched movies about the sea, long looked at the photos of acquaintances from beach vacations. It seems that she even dreamed about the sea. In general, Stanford entered college to study law, went to the city, settled in a dormitory. Mother stayed in the village. The boy's dreams were shattered gradually. He learned that lawyers are not always on the side of truth. Often you have to adjust to the situation, to people. This was discovered in practice in court, and the tasks that are solved by representatives of this profession are often not connected with something heroic. Most of the lawyers are engaged in real estate registration, or in general, the papers go through in offices for pennies. That's how one of the college professors put it. And Stanford had no reason not to trust him. The kid's down. He thought it was worth it to enroll, and that's it. Fate was arranged. A happy future was guaranteed. But no. Still, Stanford tried, studied. After all, there were other lawyers, fighters for justice, defenders of the wronged and oppressed. It was hard to get through, of course. But there is always a chance, though a small one. The older Stanford got, the clearer he realized. Everywhere you need power or money. And he, a country boy, had neither. Stanford finished his college and somehow got a job in the housing and utilities department as a paper pusher for pennies, just like the teacher had told him to. There were plenty of lawyers looking for work at the time, so the inexperienced college graduate was excited about the job. He rented a room in a dormitory and set up his life. His mother was happy for her son. He'd made it in the city after all. She was the only person who believed in Stanford's bright future. And that faith kept the boy afloat, kept him moving forward. He worked in the housing and utilities department, but he was looking for more interesting options. No luck, though. All the good jobs were occupied firmly and for a long time. It seems that there were even queues of blatant applicants for them, but Stanford tried not to be discouraged. He had little doubt that sooner or later good fortune would smile upon him. And then his mother died. Stanford lowered his head. Even in the semi-darkness, David could see that the man was barely holding back tears. It was obvious that the wound had not yet healed. And as the doctors said later, it was long overdue for an operation. And my mother, she kept thinking it would go away, taking pills to relieve the pain, putting off going to the hospital. I know why. They wouldn't let her off work. No, They would have, of course, because she had sick leave. But while she was being treated, they'd have fired her somehow. They'd have found a way. It's happened in our village before. Everyone needs healthy young workers. And Mom? She was afraid of being left without money because she had no one to rely on. I wasn't fit to defend my benefactor. I was barely making ends meet myself. I blamed myself for that. That I couldn't be a support for my mother. That I didn't have time. Stanford took the loss hard. The realization of what had happened came gradually. David understood his neighbor as no one else could. Stanford's story seemed to take him back to the time when he was suddenly without his grandmother. David had felt similar feelings and also blamed himself endlessly for not keeping his loved ones safe. I don't know what would have happened to me in the end, Stanford continued. Maybe I would have lived like a robot, or maybe I would have done something stupid. All sorts of thoughts were going through my head at the time, and it's hard to even remember now. But then Abby came into my life, and everything became somehow. I don't even know how to explain it. Anyway, she got me out. Abby got a job as a janitor at the same housing and utilities company where Stanford worked. A sweet, modest girl with constantly anxious gray eyes framed by fluffy eyelashes. Stanford didn't pay attention to her at first. In housing and utilities, it was common for new recruits to show up and then leave. The turnover was due to a combination of heavy workloads, neglectful superiors, and very modest salaries. But one day the guy literally bumped into Abby in the hallway, rushing to a neighboring office and bumping into a girl moving towards him. And as soon as he didn't notice, Abby yelped. Stanford grabbed her by the shoulders, holding her up so the girl wouldn't fall. "I'm sorry," the guy mumbled. I was about to continue on my way when I saw her eyes. No, of course not. Stanford had met Abby before, and he had seen her in the courtyard at work, in line at the cashier's office, at the planning meeting, in their cafeteria, just on the street, but he hadn't noticed her. After his mother's death, everything around him was gray and unexpressive. There was little that interested Stanford, little that attracted his attention. But those eyes, bottomless lakes from which it was impossible to look away. There was so much anxiety in them, so much trepidation. Stanford suddenly felt himself next to this girl and someone strong, confident, almost omnipotent. He wanted to be near her, to take care of her, to protect her from the dangers of this life. For the first time since the tragedy, the boy suddenly felt alive. They then stopped right there in the hallway. Each had forgotten where they were going. Stanford apologized for running into the girl, smiled. Abby assured him it was nothing, word by word, and somehow the young people agreed to a first date. That's the story of an acquaintance. It soon became clear that Abby and Stanford have a lot in common. First of all, they're the same age. Secondly, at their young age, both of them have already had to make their own way in this life. Both Abby and Stanford had no older relatives willing to help mentor and support them in life, nor did they have any close friends. That's just the way it happened. Abby grew up in an orphanage in general. She knew nothing about her parents except that both of them were alcoholics under the fences. That was the characterization the teacher used when telling the girl about her past. The child was taken from a marginalized couple because the girl was in danger with her parents. Did these people love her? Were they trying to bring her back? Abby didn't know for sure, but she assumed not. Because if to other children at least sometimes someone came, swollen, unkempt mothers, bums of saintly appearance, fathers, decrepit grandmothers, but still relatives and not indifferent people, then Abby in general no one and never visited. And so wanted to see her own, to feel them and their love. The girl would forgive these people everything, would accept them and understand, but no one came. Life in the orphanage was not sweet. Cruel children, angry teachers. Quiet, modest Abby had a hard time. She lived in anticipation of the next blow, the next bullying. The children sensed this and quietly used it for their own amusement. Abby was locked in a dark toilet at night, and her New Year's gifts, donated by the city administration, were taken away from her. Her clothes were often covered with paint or plasticine. More than once Abby was beaten just to show her strength and superiority, and the girl could neither fight back nor complain. One day Abby told her teachers about peer bullying, and she was blamed. Adults told her that she needed to be more sociable, to find a common language with other people, scared her with diagnoses, but the offenders were still punished. But that didn't make Abby feel any better. On the contrary, she was then spotted in the yard, dragged behind the gazebo and beaten again. The girl never asked adults for help again. Abby didn't do well in school, and she would have liked to be an excellent student. She reached for knowledge, read a lot, but nothing worked. Lessons were impossible to learn. Other pupils interfered, buzzed, pestered, and even, sometimes, took away notebooks and textbooks. In the orphanage, the pursuit of knowledge and diligent study was considered something almost shameful. Abby was called a nerd, a bookworm, and humiliated. In general, no one in the orphanage really learned, and teachers gave lessons for a tick. One day, Abby even heard the teachers talking. The math teacher said an offensive phrase to the Russian teacher with contempt. "Why are you talking to these morons? They won't do any good anyway. They'll follow in the footsteps of their miserable parents." Abby got tears in her eyes. Is that how she felt about them? No. She'd known before that no one at the orphanage was very nice to the kids. But it was one thing to assume, but it was another to hear herself say it. The annoying thing was, Abby knew the teacher was right. That's just the way it is. Probably accidentally overhearing that very conversation, Abby realized that it is not worth it to dream about happiness, about a bright future. Nothing good would happen to her, not even to try. Abby went to college to become a pastry chef. She studied, knowing very well that she was unlikely to find a place in her specialty, because it was too narrow, and she wasn't very good at it. Her hands did not obey well and could not repeat the operations that showed the teachers. Abby realized at the beginning that it was not hers, but all orphans. Their girls were sent to learn to be pastry chefs. So they sent her. Nothing soothed the group's curator, an unexpectedly warm-hearted, caring woman. Somehow, she just felt for Abby. She felt sorry for her, which was unusual. Few people work in the profession. Now you'll find yourself in life. Girl, don't worry. When Abby came of age, she graduated from the orphanage. It was a day she welcomed with joy. Deliverance at last. An uncertain adult life lay ahead. Now she would have to make her own way. Now no one is responsible for her, but there is no more bullying from her peers and cruel punishments from her teachers. Abby, a round orphan, received an apartment on the outskirts of the city from the state. The house was old, 3 stories, creaky floors. The room was tiny, but it was her own place. An island of tranquility, where Abby found herself a full-fledged mistress. For the first time, the girl was even a little dizzy. She could do whatever she wanted to, cook something delicious in her own kitchen, lie in bed and read without fear that someone would take her book away from her. Watching late into the night on a hand-bought TV, an old, cracked screen. So what? It works. For the first time, Abby lived on the money she had accumulated in her account during her time at the orphanage. Each pupil received a certain amount of money, but the graduates were warned that they had to find a job before these savings would run out. Abby understood this was really important. After all, she had seen the speed at which the money was being spent. All the more so because at first she was inexperienced and didn't know how to save money. She learned to save money later. As Abby supposed, she did not manage to get a job as a pastry chef. The girl understood everything about herself and evaluated her skills quite adequately. Fortunately, there were many other options. Abby tried to work as a cashier in a supermarket, but it didn't work out. There it required assertiveness somewhere, boldness, somewhere even the skills of a psychologist. Abby could not count money lightning fast. She could not serve customers quickly. She was always dissatisfied. And at the end of the shift, Abby always had a shortage, which was deducted, of course, from her salary. As a result, the girl received pennies, which were not even enough for food. It was good, though her orphan savings had not yet been completely spent. And once Abby even owed her master for the month. The salary wasn't enough to cover the shortfall. So Abby quit for good. I don't know what kind of shortage she'd get next time. Abby started looking for work again. Now her situation was desperate. She was left with no money at all. Luckily, a neighbor helped. She told her that the housing and utilities department needed a janitor. Abby, without hesitation, grabbed the offer. At that time, she had the vaguest ideas about the job of a janitor. Abby realized as she went along that this was a job she enjoyed. It's nice to spend time outdoors. It's nice to socialize with the residents. It's nice to make the area cleaner. It's nice to be thanked when dry leaves are cleaned up on time and slippery paths sprinkled with sand. Fate had one more surprise in store for them, bringing them together with Stanford. Young people, who were completely alone in the world, suddenly found each other, and it became happiness for both of them. Stanford and Abby did not meet for long. A couple of months after they met, they had already formalized their relationship and began to live together in Abby's small apartment. Stanford as a man had a hand, and the house became even cozier and more comfortable. The young husband whitewashed the ceilings, painted the walls, fixed a leaky faucet, even replaced the wiring. Abby took care of Stanford, cooked him delicious lunches and dinners, ironed his shirts, and, most importantly, was interested in how his day was. Perhaps that was the most enjoyable part. Both Abby and Stanford felt important, needed, loved. Now they were not alone on the entire planet. Life had taken on a whole new color. And then a miraculous event happened. Abby told her husband that she was expecting a child. The couple didn't seem to be planning heirs so soon, but the news pleased both of them. Of course, it was also scary how they would handle the infant. It's not like they have no one to help, no one to advise, and whether they have enough money for such a luxury. Stanford took the risky step of quitting his job at the housing and utilities company, which paid pennies, and took a job as a lawyer for a private practitioner. The latter offered him a much more substantial salary, but there was more work to be done. He had to study a lot, to understand the nuances of complicated cases, to sit in the office late into the night. Stanford did it so that Abby could quit her job. He rightly believed that the physical labor of janitorial work could be bad for the pregnancy. The man's salary was now quite high, but a private businessman is a private businessman. His business had its ups and downs, and sometimes it was jeopardized. Still, Stanford didn't regret his decision. Abby sat at home, doing the housework. Both spouses were looking forward to the arrival of the baby. And then he was born. Small, warm, screaming from the first days, looking remarkably like his father, just as green-eyed and red-haired. Abby and Stanford melted into the care of the baby. The boy was named Arthur. It was Abby's decision. It was the name of one of her favorite book characters. Stanford didn't mind. Arthur is a wonderful name. It turned out that a baby is really quite expensive. Diapers, special food, clothes from which a baby grows out of lightning fast. Not to mention drugs, strollers, cribs, toys. Stanford was getting by. He worked his ass off to make sure his family didn't need anything. They had food, they had necessities. They paid their rent. Of course, the young family could not afford anything extra. Trips to the sea, dinners in restaurants, expensive gadgets, all this was still unaffordable. But it seemed to the couple that they still had everything ahead of them. Abby was busy with the baby and the house. Stanford was working, and everything would be fine, except that with Arthur's arrival, Abby's cramped apartment was no longer a place to turn around. Not only did the number of people in the apartment increase, but the amount of stuff. Pretty soon the couple realized and they just needed to expand. Arthur was growing up. He needed more and more space. Ideally a room of his own. A single room would do, but then at least it would be newer and more spacious. And the family was not particularly satisfied with the neighborhood. The school and kindergarten were far away. The nearest bus stop is also at least a 15-minute walk away. In summer it's still okay, but in winter, try to get there. Anyway, Stanford and Abby pondered and decided they needed a mortgage. The money for the down payment could be obtained from the sale of Abby's old, cramped one-bedroom, the village house Stanford had inherited from his mother. Of course, it was a risky endeavor, losing the whole place and going into debt all at once. But Stanford had a good salary at the time. Arthur was growing up, and the time was approaching when Abby would be able to go to work. The payment seemed quite affordable, acceptable to the couple. And so it began. At first, everything went just fine. Buyers were found quickly, even for the village house, although Stanford sensed big problems with it. The proceeds were used partly for the down payment on the mortgage, partly for repairs. Abby and Stanford took a spacious one-bedroom apartment in a new neighborhood. It was bright, clean, and no one had ever lived there before. They renovated it quickly. They had the money. They furnished the rooms with inexpensive but fresh and modern furniture. They hung beautiful curtains and decorated the walls with framed photos. The pictures were of Abby, Stanford, and little Arthur alone, of course. Stanford liked to remember the first New Year's Eve in the new place. They had just finished renovating. The rooms still had the distinctive smell of killer glue and furniture. Beautiful, clean, cozy. The corner of the living room near the window was occupied by a huge, almost to the ceiling Christmas tree. Little Arthur, in funny pajamas, looked mesmerized at the flashing lights of the garlands showing the fluffy beauty. The overhead lights went out. The garlands and the flickering TV screen created a cozy, almost fairy tale atmosphere. Stanford looked at his wife and son at the apartment, at the table set with incredibly tasty dishes, potatoes with chicken, salads, fruit, and of course, champagne. What's New Year's Eve without champagne? At that moment, Stanford felt happy and peaceful. His favorite relatives were near him. It seemed that things would only get better from now on. Stanford was pleased with himself. He had done it all. He had succeeded. What they had never dreamed of had come true. On that magical, peaceful evening, the couple had no idea what trial's fate was already preparing for them. It all started the very next year. Arthur reached kindergarten. The kid got used to preschool institutions surprisingly easily. No caprices and tantrums, no endless illnesses, which frightened young parents and acquaintances. Everything went as smoothly as usual. Abby went to work. She was lucky enough to get a job as a kitchen assistant in a restaurant. The work was not particularly hard and responsible, and the pay was much higher than the salary of a janitor. The mortgage payment was a big part of the family's expenses, so the extra pennies were very welcome. Then, in the fall, misfortune came upon Abby and Stanford like a cornucopia. The young, blossoming woman suddenly began to weaken. Dizziness, nausea, loss of appetite. At first, Andrew and Abby assumed pregnancy. Both were frightened. They were not yet ready for a second child, primarily financially. The spouses realized that they would not be able to afford it, but getting rid of the baby was out of the question. So, they gathered their courage and went to the doctor. The antenatal clinic said there was no pregnancy, but Abby's tests were alarming. The woman was strongly recommended to be examined by a general practitioner. Abby, of course, made an appointment. The examination took up a lot of her time and energy. She had to leave work all the time, which of course did not please her boss. Her wife's eyes during this period were somewhat guilty, still anxious and confused. Stanford's heart clenched with pity when he looked at his wife, but the man still believed that everything would be all right. Well, if she lacked some vitamins, or if some organ was malfunctioning, it's no problem. They'll find the fault, treat it, and everything will be as before. The diagnosis sounded like a thunderclap, a rare blood disorder, presumably hereditary hypnosis. Abby couldn't check the doctor's guess, of course. She knew nothing about her relatives. And what did it matter where the disease came from? The main treatment was long, expensive, and no one gave a guarantee. The doctors, with ruthless truthfulness, immediately outlined the most likely scenario. Most likely, the disease, despite treatment, will progress. All medical manipulations can only delay the inevitable for a short while. Abby was quite resistant to her diagnosis, or maybe she was just pretending to be, for the sake of her husband and son. Stanford, on the other hand, was hit over the head with a sandbag. For a long time, he felt stunned, powerless, completely disoriented somehow. How could it be? Where had this misfortune come from all of a sudden? After all, they had only just made it out, only just started a new life. They had so many plans, so many wonderful ideas. Then Stanford came to his senses, accepted the situation, and began to act. First of all, he looked for doctors who had experience in treating patients like his wife. It was not cheap, to put it mildly. I had to sell some things, get into loans, and no one canceled the mortgage. Stanford was working alone again, and Abby was weakened. And the treatment was taking up almost all her time. Arthur was happy, not sick, well-behaved, more and more conscious and independent. He understood that his mother was ill and his father had to work hard, and he learned to serve himself, to prepare clothes for the morning, to pour tea for himself and his mother, to make sandwiches. The little boy grew up in front of his eyes. Those around him praised Arthur, setting him as an example to their children. Stanford. He wished none of this had happened. He wished his son didn't know how to tie his shoelaces or make an omelet like other kids his age. Abby wasn't getting the treatment they could afford. The family went into debt, but it was all for nothing. The young woman faded away, becoming a pale shadow of herself. Stanford pounded the doorsteps of charitable foundations, tried to get the advice of eminent professors. The latter sometimes succeeded, but these luminaries of medicine were just throwing up their hands. Abby's disease was poorly understood, unpredictable. No one knew how to help the young woman. Conventional treatment had little effect on her. Eventually, Abby was taken to the hospital, where she had been ill for about 3 years. The woman couldn't even eat anymore, she was so weak. Stanford prepared for a long struggle, even found a nurse, who for a fee would take care of his wife more carefully, but all this did not come in handy. Abby didn't live 24 hours after she was admitted to the hospital. Stanford could not believe what had happened. He had suffered another loss, a terrible, unjust loss. The situation was aggravated by the fact that now the man was not only responsible for himself, he had a son, and Arthur somehow had to explain that his mom was gone. And then another blow. Stanford lost his job. The law firm he'd worked for the last few years went bankrupt. The owner of the firm had always been on the edge, taking big risks for big profits, and he'd miscalculated one day. So Stanford was also out of work. After all, during Abby's illness, the family had accumulated a lot of debts, and the mortgage payment was a heavy burden. Stanford found a new job that paid much less, but there was no other way out. It's not easy to get a good job. That time Stanford had been lucky to find a big paycheck, or unlucky, because his earnings were so unstable. The man worked in the office during the day and worked part-time in the evenings, helping to unload a truck at the store or taking part in repairs. Arthur was on his own all this time. He did not complain. The boy could always occupy himself. Arthur liked to draw, took pencils or paints, a sheet of paper, and as if disconnected from reality. He went away from the gray reality, created whole worlds with bright rainbows, dense forests and nice big forests, which you will not meet in real life. Stanford didn't worry about his son going hungry. The main thing was to have something in the fridge: bread, sausage, eggs, milk, frozen dumplings. Arthur coped perfectly well with lunch and dinner and fed his father, who was tired after work. We lived like that, until it turned out that the apartment was going to the bank for debts. At that time, they had accumulated arrears on mortgages and loans, so they asked the man and his child to vacate the premises. Stanford tried to fight for his property as a lawyer. He filed for bankruptcy, tried to explain his plight to people, to no avail. Eventually, to avoid the attention of the child welfare authorities, he had to settle. That's how Stanford and Arthur ended up in the hostel. David made friends with them at once. He liked the honest, hard-working Stanford, and he liked Arthur, so serious and mature for his 6 years. It could be said that all three of them became pals, or even friends, and often had dinner together. David periodically took Arthur for a walk. Stanford worked a lot, and sitting in a dark hostel was boring for the child. So David took the boy for walks. They talked about everything in the world, discussed different situations, told each other something about themselves. David learned that Arthur really wanted to become an artist, but the kid realized that he had to study for that. Also, Arthur knew that his father has no money and time to take him to circles or art school, and this depresses Arthur. But the kid did not lose heart, thinking that he would go to the first grade, and there would probably be free classes for students. School was just around the corner, less than a year away. If Arthur waited for the beginning of school with joyful impatience, his father dreaded the moment. After all, then his and Arthur's small homeless family would be guaranteed to come to the attention of the guardianship authorities. A child should have a home, a workplace, his own bed, but little Arthur lives in a hostel. In fact, he's wandering around with his homeless father. Of course, no one will leave the boy with a loser parent. The child will be taken to an orphanage. Stanford knew all too well what it was like there. Abby had told him enough for the man to try to avoid the same scenario for his own child. But he lacked strength, and there was no help. Stanford was ready to work, to plow through several jobs, which in fact he did, but all these efforts did not bring the desired result. It was a long time before he could buy his own place. Stanford had some savings, but not enough for even a small part of the down payment. David cringed at the icy wind, or at the sudden rush of thoughts and memories. It was a gentle fall, more like winter. The snow will fall. It will become brighter, more elegant, softer. Little Arthur is looking forward to the new year, to get presents, to sit at the festive table, to make a wish. He is an adult already. Arthur is independent, but still a child, still quite a boy, sincerely believes that the mysterious under the chimes of the wish will come true. And David knew perfectly well what he would ask Santa Claus or someone else. In general, he understood perfectly well what little Arthur was dreaming about. The boy will ask for an apartment for him and his dad, and an art school for himself. Too bad none of those things will come true anytime soon. David's going to give Arthur something he'll love. He's already picked up a young artist kit at the store. Expensive, of course, but nothing's too bad for Arthur. A suitcase, an easel with a set of paints, pencils, and felt tip pens. The anticipation of Arthur's eyes lighting up at the sight of this splendor made David feel warm. It was so pleasant to please his loved ones, and even more so to please the children. But this miracle suitcase will not solve the problems of a little boy, and his father only partially brighten the gray everyday life of the child. Well, at least that's it. David had finally climbed up from the bridge on the embankment. Now he was walking along the parapet, in a hurry to get to work. He couldn't be late. Beverly valued him, among other things, for his diligence and reliability. He didn't want to let the man down. And then David noticed the people standing by the lantern. Men and women, teenagers, children. They were talking excitedly. Some were making phone calls, some were filming something on their phones. David followed the gazes of these people. He was stunned. He had never expected to see such a thing. In the dark waves of the wide river, 50 meters from the shore, there was something, or rather someone. A human head would emerge from under the water and then disappear again. Someone was drowning. He had no strength left. How the man ended up in the river at a time like this was no time to think about it. Without giving himself time to consider the desperate act, David had already swung over the parapet. The man immediately crossed the strip of beach. The sand poured into his sneakers. The man ran to the water's edge, throwing off his jacket, sweater, shoes, all the heavy things that would become additional ballast in the cold waves of the river. David was an excellent swimmer. The river was very close to his village. As a kid, he used to spend days there with the local boys, swimming against the clock, diving from heights, and just splashing and having fun. David felt like a fish in water by the time he was 6 years old, pun intended. But of course the man never went into the river in this weather. The cold, the wind, and the current was strong, and he'd never rescued a drowning person before. But David realized that if he didn't try to pull this man out, no one would help the unfortunate man. And then how could he live with that? He had to at least try. The man could very well imagine the desperation of a drowning man now. There are so many people around. Someone is calling the rescue team. Will they make it in time? It's a matter of seconds. The icy water burned his feet. He knew it would be cold at first, and then his body would adapt. And it did. And now the men are already approaching the drowning man in powerful groups. It is hard to swim, strong current, wind, and there is a lot of garbage in the water. Some branches, snags, tina, elderly fangs of algae. David had less and less strength left, but he could see his goal in front of him. A head of dark hair, he was close enough to see the man. It appeared to be a young girl, or even a child. Pale face, eyes black with despair and horror. She must have been a good swimmer, or she would have gone to the bottom long ago. But in any case, if David didn't hurry, she would. Finally, the man was close by. He swam up behind the girl. The necessary knowledge rose from somewhere in the depths of memory. Drowning people in a desperate attempt to survive can even drown their saviors. That's why David kept his distance. The girl's hair was long. David grabbed it and pulled her toward the shore. The girl felt that help had come. At first she wanted to reach David to cling to him, but he wouldn't let go. Then the girl kind of realized what was going on, even relaxed a little and let herself be pulled out. Yes, she wouldn't be able to handle the current alone. The girl seemed very thin, almost transparent, already on the shore, silently looked into the face of her rescuer. The poor thing had fainted. They were already waiting for them. Someone wrapped David in a blanket. Someone covered the girl. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance. The man looked around and realized everything was going to be okay now. Only then his hands trembled and his teeth chattered for some reason. It was either from the cold or from the fear he had experienced. David could have missed the girl himself at that water temperature. The focus of everyone's attention shifted to the girl. The doctors arrived, and from somewhere came an anxious tall man dressed in an expensive leather jacket. It seemed to be the girl's father. At least they both had the same hazel-colored eyes, dark blonde hair, large nose, and black cheekbones. David didn't wait for the story to unfold. He dressed quickly and hurried to Beverly's. Surely the boss would accept his tardiness when David told him the reason. But Beverly was late that day, so he didn't even have to explain. David hurried to the store to buy milk, and the next morning, when he was called by a man, he slowly turned around and met his gaze with familiar hazel-colored eyes. In front of him was a man in a stylish leather jacket. the father of the girl who had somehow ended up in the water that day. "I finally found you," the man smiled, holding out his hand to David. "It hadn't been easy. My name is Ronald Evans. I'm the father of the teenager you rescued." "Hello," David muttered. He understood that this man wanted to thank him, and David himself was eager to know what had happened to the girl, what her condition was now, how she had ended up in the water. All these days the man thought a lot about the rescued girl. He wanted to believe that she was all right. He hailed to social media. The man continued. "One of the people on the boardwalk at the time posted a video. This video clearly shows you saving my Judy. It was a brave thing to do, a desperate thing to do. There aren't many people like you these days. And what a blessing that you were there at the time. How's the girl?" David was certainly pleased to hear Ronald Evans' words, but also uncomfortable at the same time. "Judy's fine. She's in rehab right now." "So you were physically hurt?" "Not really. Just a little cold." "It's something else. Do you know how she ended up in the river? Did you see that moment?" David shook his head negatively. All because of unrequited love. She'd fallen in love with some boy, and he'd started seeing someone else. Judy got herself worked up, and that's what happened. Now she's in counseling. She's under observation. And she's on the mend. In fact, as it turns out, she realized right away what a stupid thing she'd done. Right after she got in the icy water. It would have been too late if it hadn't been for you. The important thing is that everything is fine now, David smiled. She was. Her outburst was accidental. "I think this situation taught your girl a lot." "This situation has taught me a lot," too, Ronald Evans admitted. "For many years in business, I thought there were no good, selfless people in the world who would do what you do. Cynical became cold, callous. What you did, it taught me a lot and made me rethink all my values. I've changed a lot." David nodded. "What's there to say?" "I want to thank you. I have opportunities. I know you live in a hostel. You don't have your own place. Ask for anything you want, anything at all. People like you deserve a better fate." David thought about it. He remembered Stanford's anxious eyes when he received another notice from the guardianship authorities, remembered little Arthur telling him inspiringly of his dream. The dream of becoming an artist. "My life suits me just fine," David said at last. "But there is one person, a small person, who could really use your help." Arthur was racing toward David like a fighter jet, and the latter, smiling, spread his arms apart to catch the boy and spin him around as he liked. "I won first place in the city drawing contest for that drawing of me with the cosmos. Remember I showed you?" "Of course I remember. I told you this would happen." Stanford came up next. They had agreed to take a walk in the park that Sunday afternoon. Arthur liked to run along the asphalt paths, feed the ducks in the pond, and watch the funny girls. And David and Stanford liked to sit in the local cafe. There they cooked aromatic kebabs that melted in the mouth. A little over a year had passed since that very conversation with Ronald Evans. The wealthy businessman had been amazed at David's request. After all, he wasn't asking for himself. He wanted to save his friend with a small child of two people in a desperate situation. Ronald Evans bought Stanford a one-room apartment in a new building in a good neighborhood. There was a grammar school nearby and, importantly, an art school. Stanford enrolled Arthur in it at the first opportunity. Since then, the boy's talent developed rapidly. His drawings became more and more professional and correct, but at the same time did not lose their uniqueness and spontaneity. Of course, Ronald Evans could not and did not do something personally for David, although the latter did not ask him to do so. First, the businessman and David bought an apartment near Stanford and Arthur. They became neighbors, but no longer in a hostel. Secondly, Ronald Evans gave his daughter's savior high co-paid work, took to himself as a gardener. David had always liked to tinker in the ground, to take care of plants. He belonged here. Judy, Ronald Evans' daughter. At first, she was shunned by the new gardener for some reason. Perhaps she was afraid of the memories associated with him, but then they became friends. The girl, as it turned out, regretted her action and now, after a while, could not explain even to herself how she had decided to do such a thing. Sometimes David looked at Judy, tall, thin, and touching, and his heart clenched at the thought of what it would have been like if he had not pulled the girl out of the water. Stanford and David walked slowly down the parkway. Ahead of them was a happy Arthur on a scooter. "Where are you? I thought you'd be waiting for me at the fountain." David turned around, smiled, hurried toward a short woman with piercing blue eyes. Baker. They'd met recently, but it was already clear they were serious. Today they'd agreed to go out together as a fun, noisy group. It was going to be a wonderful day.